Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing I noticed about the studio apartment wasn't the water stains on the ceiling or the ancient radiator that clanged like chains in the night. It was how the bathroom mirror seemed too large for such a cramped space, stretching almost wall to wall above the chipped porcelain sink. The landlord, a nervous man with darting eyes, had mentioned something about previous tenants leaving suddenly, but the rent was cheap enough for a newly divorced PE teacher trying to rebuild his life. I should have asked more questions. The first night, exhausted from moving boxes up 3 flights of creaking stairs, I stumbled into the bathroom to brush my teeth. The overhead bulb cast harsh shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone standing behind me in the reflection. When I turned around, nothing. Just the narrow shower stall and the window that faced what the landlord had described as a charming courtyard, but was really just a dead-end alley barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I blamed it on stress. The divorce had been brutal, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about my life. Sarah had taken the house, most of our friends, and my confidence along with her. This cramped studio in the old downtown district was supposed to be a fresh start, not a place where shadows played tricks on tired eyes. But the second night, as I reached for my toothbrush, I saw him again. Clearer this time. A figure standing directly behind me, arms crossed, watching. The reflection lasted only a few seconds, but long enough for me to notice he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, something knowing, almost satisfied. I spun around so fast I knocked over my soap dispenser. Empty space greeted me, the sound of plastic hitting tile echoing off the cramped walls. My heart hammered as I checked the shower, even opened the small linen closet, knowing it was ridiculous. No one could fit in there, and besides, I'd locked the front door. The window drew my attention next. I pressed my face against the glass, peering into the narrow alley below. Brick walls rose on either side, creating a canyon of shadow that the streetlights couldn't penetrate. The passage ended abruptly, at a blank wall maybe 20 feet from the building. There was literally nowhere for someone to hide, nowhere they could position themselves to create such a clear reflection in my mirror. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the old building made me tense, and twice I got up to check the front door's deadbolt. In the morning light streaming through the bedroom's single window, my paranoia seemed foolish. The apartment felt smaller and shabbier than it had the night before, but normal, safe. That illusion lasted until evening. This time I was prepared. I'd positioned myself carefully in front of the mirror, watching not just my own reflection, but the space behind me. For several minutes, nothing happened. I began to feel stupid, like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. Then, as I reached for my razor, the other figure materialized. The reflection was sharper now, more defined. I could make out details that made my skin crawl. He wore a faded blue t-shirt, the same one I'd worn the day before, now crumpled in my laundry basket. His hair was the same length as mine, the same color, but styled differently. Where I kept mine neat and short, his fell slightly over his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more carefree. Most disturbing of all, his movements echoed mine with a barely perceptible delay. When I raised my hand, he raised his a split second later. When I tilted my head, he followed suit, but the timing was just off enough to be noticeable. And through it all, that smile never wavered. I tried talking to the reflection, feeling ridiculous even as I did it. "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice bounced off the bathroom tiles, creating an odd echo that seemed to answer itself. But the figure in the mirror only continued mimicking my movements, that unsettling smile fixed on his face like it had been painted there. When I finally worked up the courage to turn around, he vanished instantly, leaving me staring at my own wild-eyed reflection in an otherwise empty bathroom. The next few days established a pattern that gnawed at my sanity. Every evening, as shadows lengthened and the old building settled into its nightly symphony of creaks and groans, he would appear. Each time, the reflection grew more solid, more real. I began to notice small details that shouldn't have been possible. A scar on his chin that matched one I'd gotten falling off my bike as a kid. The way he favored his left shoulder, just like I did after an old soccer injury. But there were differences too. His clothes were always mine from the previous day, as if he was living my life one day behind. When I'd worn my red polo shirt to school on Tuesday, he appeared Wednesday night wearing it. When I'd tried a new hairstyle Thursday morning, he showed up Friday evening sporting the same look, but somehow it appeared more confident on him. The worst part was how he'd started trying to reach through the glass. At first, it was subtle. A hand pressed against the mirror's surface as if testing its solidity. But gradually, his attempts became more aggressive. I'd watch, horrified as his fingers seemed to push slightly into the reflective surface, causing ripples like he was touching water instead of solid glass. Desperate for answers, I started researching the building's history. The local library's archives revealed a disturbing pattern. Every tenant of apartment 3B had left suddenly, usually in the middle of their lease. The records were vague, citing personal reasons or health concerns. But when I tracked down contact information for a few former residents, the conversations were brief and unsettling. One man hung up immediately when I mentioned the address. Another, after a long pause, simply said, "You need to get out of there before you can't tell which one is you anymore," then refused to say anything else. But the most chilling conversation was with Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd lived there in the late 90s. When I called, she was silent for so long, I thought the line had gone dead. "The mirror," she finally whispered. "I haven't looked in a mirror properly since I left that place. Never could be sure which reflection was really mine." She hung up before I could ask what she meant. By the second week, the boundary between day and night, between normal and impossible, began to blur. I'd catch glimpses of movement in every reflective surface. Windows, the black screen of my phone, even the polished chrome of the school's water fountains. Always the same figure, always wearing yesterday's clothes, always smiling that knowing smile. My students started noticing my distraction. During soccer practice, I found myself constantly glancing at the school's windows, searching for faces that shouldn't be there. My apartment became a maze of covered mirrors and avoided surfaces. I'd shower with my eyes closed, brush my teeth facing away from the bathroom mirror, but avoidance only made things worse. The night everything changed, I'd been trying to work up the courage to pack my things and leave. I'd already lost most of my security deposit, but my sanity seemed worth more than money. I was stuffing clothes into a duffel bag when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Humming. The melody was coming from the bathroom, but I was alone in the apartment. I crept toward the sound, each step making the old floorboards groan beneath my weight. The bathroom door was ajar, just as I'd left it, but warm yellow light spilled from the crack in a way that didn't match the harsh white of the overhead bulb. When I pushed the door open, the humming stopped. The mirror showed two reflections standing side by side. Both of us were wearing the gray sweatshirt I'd put on that morning. Both had the same stubble from skipping my morning shave. Both wore identical expressions of shock and fear, but only one of us was humming again, and it wasn't me. The other reflection, my doppelganger, my shadow, whatever he was, raised his hand and placed it flat against the glass from his side. This time, there was no barrier. His palm pressed through the surface, as if the mirror was made of water, creating ripples that spread outward from the point of contact. I stumbled backward, but my reflection in the mirror didn't move. Instead, the other figure stepped sideways, taking my place in the center of the reflection. Now he stood where I should be, wearing my clothes, copying my posture perfectly. When I raised my hand in horror, he raised his in perfect synchronization. But when I looked down at my own hand, I saw that it had become slightly translucent, as if I was the reflection now, as if I was the one on the wrong side of the glass. The apartment felt different suddenly, more solid and less solid at the same time. Colors seemed brighter, but also somehow fake. like a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. When I touched the bathroom wall, my hand passed through it slightly before meeting resistance, as if the surface was only mostly there. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass to peer into the alley below. For the first time, I could see movement in those shadows. Other figures walking back and forth in that impossible narrow space, all wearing clothes I recognized, all looking up at my window with faces I was beginning to recognize as my own. The truth hit me like a physical blow. There had never been just one other reflection. The alley below wasn't empty. It was crowded with them. All the previous versions of myself from every day I'd lived in this apartment. All the people I'd been, walking endlessly in that space between mirrors. That space between what is and what might be. And now, as I watched my newest reflection settle comfortably into place in the bathroom mirror, practicing my expressions and testing out my smile, I understood what Mrs. Chen had meant. I couldn't tell which one was really me anymore. The figure in the mirror waved at me with my own hand, his smile widening as he began to move around the apartment with growing confidence. He looked so real, so right, so much more like what I used to be before the divorce, before the doubt, before everything fell apart. Maybe he was more me than I was. As I write this, sitting on what might be a bed, in what might be my apartment, watching what might be my reflection live, what might be my life, I have to wonder if the other tenants really left the building at all. Or if, like me, they simply stepped too close to the mirror one too many times and found themselves on the wrong side of the glass, watching someone else wear their face and live their days. The humming has started again, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. It's a tune I don't recognize, but somehow I know all the words. And in the distance, I can hear footsteps in that narrow alley that goes nowhere, pacing back and forth like someone waiting for their turn to step into the light. Tomorrow, I think my reflection will go to work. He'll teach my classes and grade my papers and maybe even call Sarah to see how she's doing. He'll do all the things I used to do, probably better than I ever did them. And I'll be here, in this place that's almost my apartment but not quite, watching through glass that's almost a mirror but not quite, trying to remember which side of reality I'm supposed to be on. The humming is getting louder now, and I think I'm starting to understand the words. Story 2. The fluorescent lights above my workstation hummed their electric death song, casting everything in that sickly white glow that makes even healthy skin look corpse pale. 3:47 a.m., according to the digital clock embedded in my monitor's corner. The Meridian Shopping Center had been closed for hours, its vast corridors echoing with the occasional groan of settling concrete and the distant whisper of air conditioning systems cycling through their endless routines. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the familiar burn of strained retinas and too much caffeine. The database migration had to be complete by morning. Corporate breathing down my neck, threatening consequences that felt more real than the shadows dancing at the edge of my peripheral vision. My fingers moved across the keyboard in practiced rhythms, each keystroke a small rebellion against the crushing weight of the deadline. The shopping center after midnight was a different creature entirely. During the day, it pulsed with life. Families, teenagers, the elderly walking their measured loops for exercise. But now, in these dead hours, it felt like the hollow bones of some prehistoric beast. Store security gates stood like metal teeth, and the fountain in the central court had been turned off, leaving only a dark circle of pennies and wishes abandoned at the bottom. I'd been here since 6 p.m., setting up servers and running diagnostics in the small IT office tucked behind the customer service desk. Most of the other tenants had long since gone home, leaving me alone with the hum of machines and the occasional echo of my own footsteps when I ventured out for coffee from the vending machine near the food court. By 4:15, I was finally done. The migration had completed without errors, backup systems were running smoothly, and I could feel the sweet relief of another crisis averted washing over me like warm water. I packed my laptop, gathered the scattered cables and diagnostic tools, and headed for the employee exit near the loading dock. The security guard at the front desk had dozed off, his chin resting on his chest, radio crackling softly with periodic check-ins from other guards scattered throughout the building. I didn't wake him. Better to let the man catch what sleep he could during these graveyard hours. The employee parking lot stretched out before me like a black ocean, punctuated by islands of yellow light from scattered street lamps. Most of the spots were empty now, just my car and a few others belonging to the overnight cleaning crew and security staff. The air was crisp with the promise of dawn, though the sky remained stubbornly dark. I was halfway to my car when I noticed it. An old sedan, maybe from the 70s, sat in the far corner of the lot where the overhead lights created a pool of shadow. Its headlights were on, casting weak beams across the asphalt, but something about the light seemed wrong. Instead of the clean white or yellow glow of modern headlights, these emitted a pale, grayish luminescence that seemed to absorb rather than illuminate. The car had no rear license plate. Where the plate should have been, there was only a dark rectangle of metal, as if someone had carefully removed it and painted over the mounting holes. I paused, keys in hand, studying the vehicle. There was no sign of a driver, though the angle made it difficult to see through the windshield. The engine must have been running to power the headlights, but I couldn't hear anything. No idle, no rumble, no mechanical sounds at all. Just the distant hum of the shopping center's climate control systems and the soft whisper of wind through the parking lot's landscaping. Something about the scene felt deeply wrong, like walking into a room and knowing someone had been there moments before, leaving only the lingering sense of presence and the faint displacement of air. I quickened my pace toward my own car, a reliable Honda that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. As I reached my vehicle and fumbled with the door lock, I heard it, or rather didn't hear it, the absence of sound where sound should be. I turned to see the old sedan rolling toward me, its headlights growing brighter, but still emitting no engine noise whatsoever. It moved with the fluid grace of something underwater, silent and purposeful. My hand shook as I finally got the key into the lock and yanked the door open. I threw myself behind the wheel, started the engine, and backed out of the parking space with more speed than caution. In my rearview mirror, the old car continued its silent approach, headlights now close enough that I could see the strange quality of their illumination more clearly. The light wasn't just gray, it seemed to shift and pulse, creating patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. More disturbing still, every digital clock I could see, the one on my dashboard, the LED display on a nearby bank, even the timestamp on a security camera mounted on a light pole, had begun to flicker erratically. Numbers changed too quickly. Dates jumped forward and backward, as if time itself was having some kind of mechanical seizure. I gunned the engine and raced toward the parking lot exit, tires squealing against the cold asphalt. The old car followed, maintaining a steady distance of about 50 yards, its gray headlights creating a cone of wrongness that seemed to warp everything it touched. Street signs appeared to age and weather in the span of seconds when caught in that light, paint fading and metal showing rust that hadn't been there moments before. The digital clock on my dashboard had gone completely haywire. Instead of showing the current time of around 4:30 a.m., it flickered through what appeared to be random combinations of numbers. 7:42, 11:15, 23:88. Dates that couldn't exist mixed with times that made no sense. The radio cut in and out, catching fragments of broadcasts that seemed to come from different decades. News reports about events I didn't recognize. Music that sounded both familiar and alien. I took a hard right onto the main road, hoping to lose my silent pursuer in the maze of suburban streets that led to my apartment complex. But every time I checked the mirror, those gray headlights were there, maintaining their exact distance like some kind of automotive predator following the scent of prey. The most unnerving part was the complete absence of sound from the other vehicle. My engine roared and strained as I pushed it harder than I ever had before, but the car behind me moved with the silence of a ghost ship drifting through fog. It should have been impossible. Cars made noise, engines had sounds, tires gripped and released asphalt with audible friction. This thing violated every law of physics I understood. As I drove, something else began to happen. The familiar landmarks of my route home started to look different. Street signs I'd read hundreds of times appeared faded and weathered, as if years of exposure had aged them in minutes. The convenience store where I sometimes stopped for coffee looked run down, its neon signs dark, and its parking lot cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt. Most disturbing of all, I began to feel a strange disconnection from my own body, as if I was watching myself drive from somewhere slightly above and to the left. My hands on the steering wheel looked unfamiliar, older somehow, with lines and spots I didn't remember having. When I tried to focus on this sensation, it slipped away like water through my fingers, leaving only a lingering unease. I made another series of random turns, hoping to confuse whatever navigation system the other car might be using, but it followed every move with mechanical precision. The gray light from its headlights seemed to be getting stronger, and wherever it touched, things changed. A freshly painted fence became weathered and peeling. A new street lamp flickered and dimmed as if its bulb was failing. Even the leaves on trees seemed to brown and curl at the edges when caught in that strange illumination. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled into an all-night gas station, parking under the bright fluorescent canopy and rushing inside. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Jessica, looked up from her magazine as I burst through the door. "You okay, sir? You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned to look through the windows at the parking lot. The old car was there, sitting at the edge of the light, its gray headlights dim but still visible. "Do you see that car out there? The old one with the weird headlights?" Jessica followed my gaze, squinting through the glass. "What car? I just see yours under the canopy." I looked again. The old sedan was clearly visible to me, sitting in the shadows like some mechanical vulture waiting for carrion. But Jessica's confusion seemed genuine. Either she was lying, or she literally couldn't see what was right in front of both of us. "Never mind," I said, backing toward the door. "Just tired, I guess." I bought a large coffee I didn't want and returned to my car, hands shaking as I started the engine again. The digital clock on the dashboard now showed 7:23 a.m., though I was certain only minutes had passed since I'd left the shopping center. According to my car's odometer, I'd driven nearly 40 miles, though I couldn't remember traveling more than 5 or 6. The old car resumed its pursuit as soon as I left the gas station, following me through the increasingly bright morning streets with that same mechanical persistence. Other drivers seemed oblivious to its presence, changing lanes around me without apparent awareness that there was a second vehicle involved in our strange procession. When I finally reached my apartment complex, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I checked my watch, nearly 9 a.m., but that was impossible. I'd left work around 4:30, stopped at the gas station for maybe 10 minutes, and driven straight home. The trip should have taken 30 minutes at most, not 4.5 hours. I parked and sat in my car for several minutes, watching the old sedan in my rearview mirror. It had stopped at the entrance to the complex, headlights still glowing that strange gray color even in the bright morning light. Finally, I gathered my courage and got out of the car. The moment my feet touched the pavement, the old car began to move again, backing away from the complex entrance with the same silent grace it had shown all morning. It rolled backwards down the street, headlights fading gradually until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the normal sounds of morning traffic and suburban life. I stood there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. When I finally went inside, my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was checking her mail. "Good morning, David," she said pleasantly. "Haven't seen you in a few days. How was your business trip?" "Business trip?" I asked, confused. "I haven't been on any business trip." She gave me an odd look. "You left Monday morning with that big suitcase. Today's Thursday. Are you feeling all right, dear?" I ran upstairs to my apartment, hands shaking as I unlocked the door. The calendar on my kitchen wall showed Thursday, October 15th, but the last date I remembered clearly was Monday, October 12th. 3 days had simply vanished from my life, leaving only the memory of a night drive that should have lasted 30 minutes but had somehow consumed nearly 5 hours. Over the following weeks, it happened again, and again. Each time I would stay late at work, and each time the old car would be waiting in the parking lot when I finally left. The pursuits became routine, though no less terrifying. The gray headlights would follow me home through streets that seemed to age years and minutes, past digital clocks that spun through time like broken slot machines. while hours or sometimes entire days disappeared from my life. I began to document everything, time-stamped photos that showed my car's clock jumping forward inexplicably, videos of the pursuit that somehow came out blank or corrupted, notes about missing days that I would find in my own handwriting, describing events I couldn't remember. The worst part was the gradual realization that I was aging faster than I should be. Lines appeared around my eyes seemingly overnight. My hair began to show gray that hadn't been there before. My joints ached in ways they never had, as if years of wear were accumulating in days. I tried everything. Different routes home, leaving work at different times, even sleeping in the office to avoid the parking lot entirely. But somehow, the old car always found me. It was as if it existed in the spaces between moments, waiting patiently for me to emerge into the night. The shopping center's security footage became my obsession. I convinced the head of security to let me review the tapes from each night, hoping to find some clue about the car's origin or destination. What I found was even more disturbing than I'd expected. The car never appeared on the cameras. According to the official record, I was the only vehicle in the lot during those late-night hours. But more troubling still, I discovered something else in the footage, a blind spot in the parking lot's coverage. A small area near the far corner where the camera angles created a triangle of shadow that no lens could penetrate. According to the security logs, that spot had never been illuminated by any light source. Not the overhead fluorescence, not car headlights, not even the sun during daytime hours. It was a void in the visual record, a place where the normal rules of observation seemed to break down. I knew, with the certainty that comes from dreams and nightmares, that the old car emerged from that blind spot each night. And I knew, with equal certainty, that if I wanted to reclaim the time it had stolen from me, I would have to go there and face whatever was waiting in that space where light couldn't reach. The plan formed slowly, like sediment settling in still water. I would wait for the car to appear, then instead of fleeing, I would drive directly to that blind spot. I would park there, in the darkness between the cameras, and confront whatever was behind the wheel of that silent vehicle. The opportunity came on a Friday night in early November. I had finished another late project, another crisis barely averted, and the familiar weight of exhaustion hung on my shoulders like a lead blanket. As I walked across the empty parking lot, I saw the old car in its usual spot, headlights glowing that sickly gray color. But this time, instead of rushing to my own vehicle, I walked directly toward the blind spot. The area was exactly as I remembered from the security footage. A triangular patch of darkness where the geometry of the lights created an island of shadow in the middle of all that artificial illumination. As I approached, I could feel something changing in the air around me. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the sounds of the night seemed to fade until all I could hear was my own heartbeat and the soft whisper of my breath. Behind me, I heard the old car's engine start up, the first time I'd ever heard any sound from the vehicle at all. The engine noise was wrong, too deep and too hollow, like the sound a cave might make if it could breathe. I turned to see the car rolling toward me with deliberate slowness, its headlights growing brighter as it approached. I stood my ground in the center of the blind spot, feeling the strange sensation of existing in a space that cameras couldn't see and lights couldn't reach. The old car stopped just at the edge of the shadow, its headlights creating a wall of gray luminescence that seemed to press against the darkness like something physical. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the surrounding silence. What emerged wasn't exactly human, though it wore the rough shape of a man. It moved with the mechanical precision of clockwork, each step measured and deliberate. Its face was a blur of features that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them, sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes not entirely there at all. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like sound traveling through water. "You've been losing time," it said, and the words seemed to echo from inside my own skull. "You've been stealing it," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Stealing suggests ownership. Time belongs to no one. I simply redistribute it. Take from those who have too much. Give to those who have too little. And who decides who has too much? The thing that might have been a man smiled, though the expression was more suggestion than reality. Time decides. It always does. You work too much, sleep too little, miss too many moments. The time you waste is time others could use. I felt a strange understanding beginning to form, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. You're not stealing my time. You're showing me how much I've already lost. Every night you stay late. Every morning you rush past without seeing. Every conversation you're too busy to have. All of that accumulates. All of that adds up. I simply make the loss visible. The gray light from the car's headlights seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I could feel something pulling at me, a sensation like being slowly unraveled from the inside out. But for the first time since this all began, I wasn't afraid. How do I get it back? You can't. Time only moves in one direction, but you can stop losing more. And if I don't? The figure gestured toward the car, and I could see other shapes moving inside it now. Shadows of people who might have been there, or might never have existed at all. Then eventually you'll have no time left to lose, and someone else will have to learn what you couldn't. I stood there in the blind spot, in the space between camera angles, feeling the weight of every late night and missed opportunity pressing down on me like accumulated snow. The thing that might have been human was already walking back toward the car, its purpose apparently fulfilled. "Wait," I called out. "What are you?" It paused with one hand on the car door. "I'm what happens when time runs out. I'm the space between seconds. I'm every moment you forgot to live." The car door closed with that same soft click, and the vehicle began to back away into the darkness beyond the parking lot. As it disappeared, I felt something shift inside me. Not a return of lost time, but an awareness of how much remained. I walked back to my own car, started the engine, and drove home through streets that looked exactly as they should. The digital clocks showed the correct time, the landmarks were familiar and unchanged, and when I arrived at my apartment, only 30 minutes had passed. But something fundamental had changed. I could feel it in the way the morning light looked different, in the way my neighbor's greeting sounded like music, in the way time itself seemed more precious because I finally understood how finite it really was. I never saw the old car again, but sometimes, late at night when I'm tempted to stay at the office for just one more hour, I remember the gray headlights and the space between camera angles, and I choose to go home instead. The blind spot is still there, of course. It will always be there, waiting in the geometry of shadows for the next person who needs to learn what I learned. Time is the only currency that matters, and once spent, it can never be earned back. But knowing that, really knowing it, might be the most valuable thing I've ever stolen back from the dark. Story 3. The first time I raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in greeting, I was 19 and driving my father's rusted pickup through the back roads of Kansas. An old farmer in a beat-up Chevy had done it first. Just a casual lift of his hand. 2 fingers extended like a peace sign laid sideways. Something about that gesture felt right. Civilized even, in the endless stretches between towns where strangers were the only company you'd find. 23 years later, the habit had become as automatic as breathing. 2 fingers up, a brief acknowledgement that we were both out here in the dark, pushing through the night toward whatever waited at the other end. Most truckers returned the gesture. Some commuters did too, especially on the lonelier highways where courtesy still meant something. I've been a traveling sales rep for industrial lubricants for the better part of 2 decades now, and I know every interstate, state route, and farm road between Chicago and Denver. The night shifts pay better, and there's something peaceful about having the highway mostly to yourself. Just you, the radio static, and the occasional pair of headlights coming the other direction. That Tuesday in October started like any other. I'd finished my calls in Omaha and was heading west on I-80, planning to push through to Grand Island before finding a motel. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when I saw the van. It materialized out of the darkness ahead like something born from the asphalt itself. A black van with matte paint that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights rather than reflect it. No license plate that I could see. No company logos. Nothing to identify it except its unsettling presence in my lane, moving maybe 10 miles under the speed limit. I checked my mirrors and swung into the passing lane. As I drew alongside, I caught a glimpse of the driver's side window, tinted so dark it might as well have been painted black. Out of habit, I raised my hand and flicked up 2 fingers in greeting. The response came slowly, unnaturally so. A pale hand emerged from the darkness of the van's interior, fingers extended in the same gesture, but the movement was wrong somehow. The arm seemed too long. The gesture held for too many seconds, following my car as I passed. In my peripheral vision, I could see that ghostly hand, still waving, still keeping pace through the passenger window. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just another driver being overly friendly. Maybe someone who didn't understand the brief, casual nature of the highway wave. I accelerated past the van and watched it shrink in my rearview mirror until its headlights were just another pair of distant stars on the empty road. For the next 10 minutes, everything seemed normal. A few semis heading east, their headlights creating brief daylight before fading back into memory. The radio crackled with late-night talk show chatter, something about UFO sightings in Nebraska. I was considering changing the station when I noticed the electronic road sign ahead. Continue waving it, read in bright orange letters. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread it. Highway signs usually displayed weather warnings or construction notices, not bizarre commands. But as I drew closer, the message remained unchanged. Continue waving in official Department of Transportation typography, as real as the concrete beneath my tires. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Some highway worker's idea of a prank maybe, or a malfunction in the sign's programming. These things happened. I'd seen signs displaying scrambled text before, nonsense characters that meant nothing to anyone. But the next sign, 5 miles later, read the same thing. Continue waving. And the next one after that. The radio began to cut out, dissolving into static that sounded almost like whispers if I concentrated too hard. I reached over to adjust the tuning, and that's when I noticed the highway had become completely empty. No eastbound traffic, no westbound trucks, nothing but empty lanes stretching into the darkness ahead and behind. That's when the van appeared in my rearview mirror. It hadn't been there moments before. I would have seen its headlights approaching. But now, it was there, maybe a quarter mile back, maintaining a steady distance that felt deliberate, predatory. The same matte black paint, the same dark windows, the same unsettling presence that made my skin crawl. I pressed the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb from 70 to 80 to 90. The van kept pace effortlessly, never gaining, never falling back, like we were connected by an invisible string. Another electronic sign blazed to life ahead. Continue waving. This time, I could swear the letters pulsed slightly, as if they were breathing. My mouth went dry. This wasn't possible. Signs didn't display personal messages to individual drivers. The highway patrol didn't have the technology or the interest to single out one traveling salesman on a routine drive through Nebraska. But as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, my dashboard lights began to flicker. First the radio display, then the speedometer, then the entire instrument panel. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled back into its normal rhythm. In the rearview mirror, the van had somehow moved closer without appearing to accelerate. Its headlights filled my mirror now, 2 bright eyes staring directly into my soul. I raised my hand and gave the 2-finger wave. Immediately, the dashboard lights steadied. The engine's purr returned to normal. The van dropped back to its original distance, as if satisfied with my compliance. My heart hammered against my ribs as the implications sank in. Somehow, impossibly, my simple gesture of highway courtesy had become a requirement for my car to function properly. The thought was insane, the kind of delusion that belonged in a psychiatric ward, not on a real highway in the real world. But when I let my hand drop back to the steering wheel and kept it there for the next 5 miles, the engine began to stutter again. The headlights dimmed. The radio dissolved into that whispering static, and in the mirror, The van crept closer, its presence like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I waved again. Everything returned to normal. Continue waving. Read the next sign. And the next. And the next. Miles blurred past in a nightmare routine. Wave, drive, feel the engine falter when I stopped. Wave again, continue. My right arm began to ache from the constant motion. My mind raced through possible explanations, each one more desperate than the last. Some kind of remote control device affecting my car's electrical system. A prank by automotive terrorists. A government experiment in behavioral modification. None of it made sense. None of it explained the van's impossible movements or the personal messages on signs that should have been controlled by a state transportation department hundreds of miles away. I tried to pull over at a rest stop near Kearney, but as soon as I signaled my intention to exit, every light on my dashboard went dark. The power steering failed. The engine died completely, leaving me coasting on momentum alone. Behind me, the van's headlights blazed brighter, rushing forward like a predator sensing weakness. I yanked the wheel back into the travel lane and raised my hand in that damned wave. The engine roared back to life. The dashboard illuminated. The van settled back into its following position. Good. Read the next electronic sign. Continue waving. The word good sent ice through my veins. This wasn't random anymore. Something was watching, evaluating, approving of my compliance. Something that could control not just my car, but apparently the entire highway infrastructure around me. I thought about my wife sleeping safely in our bed in Denver, about my daughter starting her sophomore year at Colorado State, about the normal, rational world I'd left behind when I'd made that first, innocent gesture to the van. That world felt as distant now as childhood, a place I might never see again. The van's driver remained invisible behind those black windows, but I could feel their attention like a physical weight. What did they want? Why had they chosen me? What would happen if I simply refused to play their game? I found out 20 miles later. A semi-truck appeared ahead, the first other vehicle I'd seen in an hour. Relief flooded through me as I realized I wasn't completely alone on this nightmare highway. As I approached the truck, I considered not waving, just to see what would happen. Maybe the presence of another driver would break whatever spell had been cast over this stretch of road. I kept my hands on the wheel. Immediately, my car began to convulse. The engine misfired violently, throwing me forward against my seatbelt. The steering wheel jerked left and right in my hands, as if some invisible force was wrestling for control. In the mirror, the van surged forward, its headlights now blindingly bright. The semi-truck's driver was waving to me, a normal, friendly two-finger salute. But as I struggled to return the gesture with my car bucking like a wild horse beneath me, I realized with horror that the truck driver wasn't looking at me at all. His wave was directed at something else, something behind me, something in the van. The moment I managed to raise my shaking hand and return the wave, my car stabilized. But in that instant of eye contact with the trucker, I saw his face clearly in my headlights. His expression was blank, vacant, his eyes reflecting the light like a nocturnal animal's. His wave continued long after our vehicles had passed, his arm still moving up and down in that mechanical rhythm, even as he disappeared into my rearview mirror. "Excellent," proclaimed the next sign. "Continue waving." My hands were shaking now, and not from the road vibration. The trucker had been like me, trapped in this same horrible routine, condemned to wave at every vehicle forever. How many others were out there on the highways, caught in this same web of inexplicable compulsion? I thought about pulling out my cell phone, calling 911, trying to explain to some dispatcher that I was being stalked by a supernatural van that could control electronic signs and automotive systems. The phone sat in my pocket like a dead weight. Even if I could make the call, even if someone believed me, what could they do? Send a patrol car that would probably be empty of officers, driven by another vacant-eyed victim of whatever force had claimed this highway. The van followed me through Kearney, past Grand Island, across the endless plains of central Nebraska. Every time I waved at another vehicle, the van's driver waved back. That same slow, deliberate gesture with the too long arm. Every time I hesitated, my car began to fail. Every electronic sign carried the same message. Continue waving. Dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, painting the sky a sickly yellow-green that made everything look diseased. I'd been waving for 6 hours straight. My arm felt like it was on fire. My mind felt like it was dissolving. As the sun climbed higher, other vehicles began to appear. Morning commuters heading to jobs in North Platte, ranchers driving to check their cattle, normal people living normal lives. Each one returned my wave with that same blank expression, that same mechanical motion. And behind me, always behind me, the van maintained its vigil. I began to wonder if I'd ever driven any other route, ever lived any other life. The memory of my home in Denver felt like something I'd seen in a movie. My wife's face was becoming hard to remember. Had I always been driving this highway, always been waving at strangers, always been followed by a van whose driver I couldn't see? Forever, read the next sign. Continue waving, forever. The word hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a prank or an experiment or even a supernatural encounter with a beginning and an end. This was my life now. This was what I'd become the moment I'd raised my hand in greeting to something that should never have been on the highway in the first place. I looked in my rearview mirror, trying once more to catch a glimpse of the van's driver. But all I could see was my own reflection in the mirror, my own face staring back at me with vacant eyes and a mechanical expression. My own hand was raised in that damned wave, though I couldn't remember lifting it. Had I been the van all along? Was I the one following some other poor traveler, trapping them in this endless cycle of compulsory courtesy? Or was the van following me because I was already one of them, already claimed by whatever force patrolled these highways looking for victims? Welcome, read the final sign as I crossed the Colorado border. Continue waving. I wave at every car that passes now. I can't remember when I started, can't remember when I'll stop. My arm moves up and down like a metronome, keeping time with something I can't hear or understand. In my rearview mirror, sometimes I see the van. Sometimes I see other cars. Sometimes I see nothing but empty roads stretching back to wherever I came from. But I always wave, and somewhere behind me, in front of me, around me, other drivers wave back. We're all part of it now, part of whatever claimed that first driver on that first dark highway so many years ago. The radio plays static that sounds like breathing. The signs tell me to continue waving. My car runs perfectly as long as I obey. And somewhere in the distance, getting closer or farther away, I can no longer tell which, a matte black van follows someone else down a dark highway, waiting for them to wave back. Story 4. The first thing you notice about the municipal animal shelter isn't the smell, though that hits you like a wall of disinfectant mixed with something deeper, earthier. It's the silence that comes after the barking stops. Complete. Unnatural. Like the building itself is holding its breath. I should have known better than to take a temporary security job at a place being renovated, but 3 months of unemployment had stripped away most of my pickiness. The day shift supervisor, Martinez, walked me through the layout with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Half the facility was wrapped in plastic sheeting and caution tape. The other half housed 63 dogs and cats waiting for adoption or, well, the other option nobody liked to discuss. Power gets wonky during construction, Martinez had said, jangling a massive ring of keys. Sometimes the lights cut out in sections. Don't worry about it. Backup generator kicks in after a few minutes. Animals get spooked, but they settle down. What he didn't mention was how they settled down. My first week passed without incident. I'd make my rounds every 2 hours, checking locks, monitoring the security cameras, ensuring the construction materials remained undisturbed. The animals would stir when I passed, some whimpering, others pressing against their cage doors for attention. Normal shelter behavior. During the day, the place buzzed with activity. Volunteers, staff, potential adopters. But after midnight, it became something else entirely. The second week, I started noticing patterns. It began with Buster, a German Shepherd mix in Kennel 7. During my 11 p.m. round, he'd be pacing, restless, occasionally barking at shadows. But when I returned at 1 a.m., he'd be statue still, staring at the far end of the corridor. Not just looking, fixed, intense, like a hunting dog pointing at prey. The other dogs in his section would mirror his behavior exactly. 12 animals, all facing the same direction, all motionless. They were staring at the door to the old veterinary clinic. The clinic had been sealed off during renovation. Asbestos concerns, Martinez claimed. A single metal door with a deadbolt, painted institutional green and marked with faded biohazard warnings. During construction hours, it remained just another closed door. But in the deep night hours, it seemed to draw every pair of eyes in the facility. I told myself it was coincidence. Animals have better senses than humans. Maybe they heard something inside, pipes settling, electrical humming, the building skeleton adjusting to renovation stress. But the staring lasted for hours, and it wasn't just the dogs. The cats did it too, pressed against the fronts of their cages, yellow and green eyes reflecting my flashlight beam like dozens of tiny lanterns. The third week brought the camera feeds. I'd started paying closer attention to the security monitors, trying to understand what captivated the animals so completely. The black and white screens showed empty corridors, motionless cages, and that door. Always that door. But during the periods when the animals entered their trance-like state, the image quality would degrade. Static lines would crawl across the screen like digital insects. The timestamp would occasionally skip, 11:47 p.m. jumping to 11:52 p.m. without explanation. It was during one of these glitched periods that I saw them. Shadows moving within shadows. Dark shapes that didn't correspond to anything physical in the frame. They moved with purpose, flowing along the corridor walls toward the animal cages. As the static cleared, the shadows would be gone, but the animals would be different, calmer, somehow satisfied, though they maintained their vigil toward the clinic door. I reviewed the footage dozens of times, convinced I was seeing compression artifacts or electrical interference. But the shadows had definition, intentionality. They moved like hands. Sleep became elusive. During my off hours, I'd find myself researching the shelter's history, diving into municipal records and newspaper archives. The building had served various purposes over the decades. A quarantine facility in the 1960s, a temporary medical clinic during a flu outbreak in the 80s, and finally an animal shelter. Nothing particularly sinister, just the mundane progression of civic utility. But I did find Dr. Eleanor Vasquez. She'd been the shelter's veterinarian for nearly 15 years, before retiring 2 years ago. Local newspaper had run a small piece about her departure. Dedicated vet retires after years of service. The accompanying photo showed a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands. The article mentioned her particular connection with the more troubled animals, her ability to calm even the most aggressive or traumatized rescues. I tracked down her address and visited on a Thursday afternoon, convincing myself I was conducting legitimate security research. Dr. Vasquez lived in a small house filled with the organized chaos of someone who'd devoted their life to caring for others. 3 cats wandered freely while she served coffee from chipped mugs that featured cartoon animals. She listened to my carefully edited account, strange animal behavior, possible disturbances near the old clinic, with the patience of someone accustomed to concerned pet owners. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with deliberate slowness. "They were my life's work," she said finally. "Every animal that came through those doors. The healthy ones, the sick ones, the ones too damaged to trust human touch. I couldn't save them all, but I tried to help them find peace." I pressed for more details about the clinic, about any incidents or unusual events. She deflected with stories about successful adoptions and heartwarming recoveries. But when I mentioned the animals' nighttime behavior, her expression shifted. "Animals understand things we don't," she said. "They sense presences, energies, connections that we've trained ourselves to ignore. If they're watching something, maybe you should pay attention to what they're trying to tell you." That night I brought a digital camera to supplement the security feeds. The animals began their nightly ritual at 11:43 p.m. Every dog, every cat, every creature in the facility turned toward the clinic door with mechanical precision. I positioned myself at the far end of the corridor, camera ready, determined to document whatever was happening. The overhead fluorescence flickered twice, then died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting the hallway in dim red pools. The animals remained motionless, their eyes now glowing like embers in the darkness. I raised the camera and began shooting, using the flash to illuminate sections of the corridor in rapid bursts. Through the camera's LCD screen, I saw them clearly. Translucent figures moving along the walls and floor, human in shape but wrong in proportion. Arms too long, fingers that seemed to multiply as they moved. They flowed between the cages like water finding the shortest path, reaching through the bars to touch the animals. Where the figures made contact, the animals' rigid postures would relax slightly, though their gaze never wavered from the clinic door. I took dozens of photos, my hands shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. When the regular lighting returned 15 minutes later, the figures vanished, but the animals maintained their vigil. Reviewing the photos on my camera revealed nothing but empty hallways and static interference, but I knew what I'd seen. The fourth week brought physical evidence. During my morning sweep before the day shift arrived, I found them scattered across the floor near the clinic door. Small pieces of metal, twisted and shaped with impossible precision. They looked like lockpicks or dental tools, but their form suggested something else entirely. Tiny metal sculptures of animal paws. Some resembled cat paws, others dog paws, a few that might have been bird feet. Each was crafted with meticulous detail, down to individual toe pads and claw marks. I collected them in an evidence bag, unsure what constituted evidence in this situation. The metal was warm to the touch and left my fingers tingling with a sensation I couldn't identify. Under my desk lamp at home, they revealed intricate engraving work, patterns that looked almost like fingerprints, if fingerprints belonged to creatures that weren't quite human. Research into metalworking techniques led nowhere. The precision and artistry required for such small pieces suggested either advanced machinery or superhuman skill. But the warmth, the way they seemed to pulse with their own subtle energy, defied rational explanation. I started carrying them in my pocket during shifts, treating them like talismans against whatever was happening in that building. The fifth week changed everything. I'd fallen into a routine of paranoid observation, documenting the nightly phenomena while maintaining the pretense of normal security duties. The animals' behavior had become predictable. The same 11:43 p.m. start time, the same duration, the same ending when the figures would fade and normal activity would resume. But Tuesday night, the pattern broke. The animals assumed their positions at the usual time, but instead of their typical still observation, they began moving within their cages. Not frantically or aggressively, but with purpose. Dogs would pace in tight circles, cats would weave between the bars of their enclosures, all while maintaining their focus on the clinic door. A low humming filled the air, not mechanical, but organic. Dozens of throats producing a harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate through the building's walls. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the metal cage doors. The security monitors flickered more violently than usual, cycling between normal feeds and static-filled images that showed impossible things. Corridors stretching beyond the building's actual dimensions, rooms that didn't exist, and always, that clinic door standing open. But when I looked down the hallway with my own eyes, the door remained closed and locked. The humming grew louder, more complex. Individual animal voices joined the chorus, creating harmonies that human ears weren't designed to process. The sound seemed to pull at something deep in my chest, a resonance that made my bones ache and my vision blur at the edges. Then I noticed my keys. The massive ring Martinez had given me was moving on my belt, keys shifting and rearranging themselves without any external force. The clinic key, an old brass piece that looked different from the modern steel keys for everything else, had worked its way to the front of the ring and was glowing with a faint phosphorescent light. The animal's humming intensified, becoming almost orchestral in its complexity. In the monitor feeds, the impossible corridors grew brighter, as if lit by an approaching source. And in my pocket, the metal paw sculptures had grown warm enough to feel through the fabric of my uniform. I understood then what they wanted, what they'd been trying to tell me through weeks of patient vigil. Something waited behind that door. Something connected to Dr. Vasquez, to the animals she'd cared for, to the countless creatures that had passed through this facility over the decades. The humming wasn't random. It was communication, a collective voice trying to convey urgency and need. But understanding didn't make the choice easier. I stood in that freezing corridor, watching 63 animals stare at a door that might or might not contain answers, holding keys that might or might not unlock them. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations: stress-induced hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning from the construction work, a psychological break triggered by isolation and irregular sleep patterns. The rest of me felt the metal paws burning against my leg and heard the desperate harmony of creatures trying to complete something left unfinished. Two options crystallized with terrifying clarity. I could use the glowing key, open the clinic door, and release whatever force had been drawing the animals' attention for weeks. The humming suggested anticipation, welcome, completion. But completion of what? And what would emerge from a room that had been sealed for renovations, a room that appeared larger in the monitor feeds than it could possibly be? Or I could walk to the main electrical panel and cut power to the entire building. The construction supervisor had shown me the emergency shutdown procedure during my first day, a red lever behind a locked panel that would kill electricity to everything except the backup generator. Without the main power grid, the building would be plunged into the kind of absolute darkness that seemed to attract the figures I'd seen moving through the corridors. In that darkness, the animals would be vulnerable to whatever reached through the bars to touch them. But the clinic door would remain sealed, its electronic locks dependent on power I would have removed. The humming reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. On the monitors, the impossible corridors blazed with approaching light. The clinic key in my hand pulsed like a heartbeat, growing hot enough to burn. I had to choose. As I reached for either the key or the electrical panel, a new sound cut through the animal's chorus, the soft click of metal tumblers falling into place. The clinic door's deadbolt was turning, slowly, deliberately, though no key touched the lock. The door began to open. Golden light spilled into the corridor, warm and welcoming, carrying the scent of clean fur and gentle hands. Within that light I glimpsed movement, shadows that might have been human figures, might have been something else entirely. The animals' humming transformed into sounds of greeting, recognition, joy, and I realized that my choice had already been made for me. Or perhaps it had been made long ago, by someone who understood that love doesn't end with breathing, and that some connections transcend the boundaries we think define reality. The metal paws in my pocket went cold and still. The last thing I remember clearly is stepping toward that golden light, my hand no longer reaching for keys or electrical panels, but extended in greeting to whatever waited beyond the door. When my replacement found me the next morning, I was sitting in the corridor outside the clinic, the door sealed and locked as it had always been. The animals were sleeping peacefully in their cages, and the security footage showed nothing but normal overnight activity. I couldn't explain the metal sculptures scattered around me, or why my uniform smelled like antiseptic and fur and something else. Something warm and kind that I couldn't identify but didn't want to forget. They said I'd had a breakdown. Stress, isolation, too many night shifts. Perfectly understandable for someone working alone in a building under renovation. The temporary position ended by mutual agreement, and I found myself back in the daylight world of rational explanations and normal jobs. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear that humming, and sometimes I think it's calling me home. Story 5. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned with secrets I wasn't meant to hear. 3 weeks into my job as night janitor at the Riverside Billiards Club, I'd grown accustomed to the building's nocturnal symphony. The settling timbers, the distant hum of the heating system, the occasional creak of walls adjusting to temperature shifts. What I hadn't expected was the sound of ivory clicking against felt, the soft whisper of balls rolling across tables that I'd personally covered with protective tarps hours earlier. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was the old radiator pipes. Buildings this ancient, constructed in 1923 according to the brass plaque by the entrance, developed their own languages of expansion and contraction. But radiators don't create the precise rhythm of a break shot, don't produce the unmistakable thunk of a cue ball striking its target with perfect English. I stood in the doorway of the main hall, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate 12 covered tables arranged in perfect symmetry. Each tarp lay exactly as I'd left it, corners tucked, edges straight. Yet the sounds continued, a gentle rolling like marbles across hardwood, followed by the distinctive crack of collision. My supervisor, Marcus, had warned me about the building's quirks during my brief orientation. The Riverside was scheduled to become a museum celebrating the golden age of American billiards, and my job was simple: maintain security, ensure the antique tables remained pristine, and document any maintenance issues for the renovation team. He had mentioned nothing about ghostly games echoing through empty halls. The second night brought the same sounds, but this time I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the supply closet adjacent to the main hall, door cracked just enough to observe. At exactly 2:17 a.m. the sounds began, not random noise but deliberate, purposeful movement. I counted the rhythm: roll, pause, strike, pause, roll again. Someone, or something, was playing a methodical game. I emerged from my hiding spot and approached table 7, where the sound seemed most concentrated. The tarp lay undisturbed, but underneath, I could hear the faint whisper of felt brushing against felt, the subtle vibration of balls settling into new positions. My hands trembled as I reached for the corner of the covering. The balls were arranged in perfect formation, spelling out a single word: Saya. In the 3 seconds it took me to process what I was seeing, the balls scattered, rolling to the edges of the table with natural physics, as if released from some invisible constraint. I stood there, flashlight wavering, questioning whether I'd actually seen the impossible arrangement, or if my mind was manufacturing patterns from chaos. I tried researching Saya the next morning, thinking it might be some billiards term I didn't know. Google offered only foreign language results. Portuguese, it seemed, meaning get out or leave. The coincidence felt too deliberate to ignore, yet too absurd to accept. By the 4th night, I'd developed a routine. I'd complete my official rounds by midnight, then position myself strategically throughout the building, noting the exact times when sounds occurred, their duration, their apparent source. I filled a notebook with observations, trying to establish patterns, looking for logical explanations that my increasingly frayed nerves could accept. The sounds weren't random. They followed the rhythm of actual games: opening breaks, careful positioning shots, the satisfying drops of successful pockets. Whoever or whatever was playing possessed genuine skill, the kind that comes from decades of practice. The games lasted exactly 47 minutes each night, ending abruptly at 3:04 a.m. On the 7th night, I found the word again, this time on table 3. Saya, spelled out in pristine formation, the balls perfectly aligned as if placed by an obsessive craftsman. I photographed it with my phone, hands shaking so badly the first 3 shots were blurred beyond recognition. When I looked up from the camera screen, the balls had scattered again. I showed the photographs to Marcus the following morning, expecting skepticism or concerns about my mental state. Instead, he studied the images with an expression I couldn't interpret. Not surprise, but something closer to resignation. "Listen," he said, handing back my phone. "There are things about this place that the museum board doesn't advertise. Probably better that way." He told me about the club's history, about the tournament in 1954 that had ended in controversy. 5 of the country's most celebrated players had participated in what was meant to be the championship match of the decade: Harold "Precision" McKenzie, Antonio Restrepo, James the Surgeon Kellerman, Mickey 8-Ball Torino, and Dutch the Professor Vanderburg. Legends, all of them, masters of their craft, who had dominated competitions throughout the 40s and early 50s. The tournament had lasted 3 days. On the final night, with only 2 players remaining, the building's electricity had failed. When power was restored the following morning, the 5 champions had vanished. Their cars remained in the parking lot, their personal belongings untouched in the clubhouse lockers, their final match unfinished on table 12. Nobody ever found them, Marcus said. Police investigated for months. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. They just weren't there anymore. I wanted to dismiss it as local folklore, the kind of embellished history that accumulates around old buildings like dust. But that night, when the sounds began again, I noticed something different. The games weren't solitary anymore. I could distinguish multiple rhythms, separate sequences of shots occurring simultaneously across different tables. 5 distinct playing styles, each with its own tempo and strategy. The revelation came during my second week, when I decided to lift more tarps during the nightly games. Each active table revealed the same phenomenon: balls arranged in deliberate formations, then scattering the moment my light illuminated them. But on table 12, the arrangement was different. The balls formed no words, just a standard rack position, as if waiting for a break shot that never came. Beside the rack, a vintage cue stick lay across the table's edge, its shaft worn smooth by countless hands, its tip perfectly chalked. I'd never seen that cue before. Over the following nights, I discovered more cues. Each table held one, all different, all obviously antique, all bearing the subtle wear patterns of serious use. The one on table 7 had a distinctive mother-of-pearl inlay, while table 3's cue featured an elaborate carved handle. Each seemed to possess its own personality, its own history of championship-level play. I researched the missing players obsessively, finding newspaper clippings and tournament records in the library's archived sports sections. Harold Mackenzie's signature cue had featured a mother-of-pearl inlay. Antonio Restrepo had been famous for his carved wooden handles. The descriptions matched the cues I'd found, down to the smallest details. The night before the museum's scheduled opening, I arrived at work with a crowbar hidden in my supply cart. I'd made my decision. Whatever was happening in the Riverside wasn't natural, and it wasn't coincidence. The missing champions, the unfinished tournament, the nightly games, everything connected in ways that defied rational explanation, but the evidence was overwhelming. I could break the cues, destroy whatever connection bound these presences to the building, or I could stay, watch, try to understand what they wanted from me. The sounds began earlier that night, at 11:30 p.m. instead of the usual 2:17. Not just the familiar rhythms of invisible games, but something else. A low humming, almost musical, like voices harmonizing in a language I couldn't identify. The temperature in the main hall dropped noticeably, my breath visible in small puffs as I moved between the tables. Every tarp had been removed. Not by me, not by any human agency I could imagine. They lay folded neatly on chairs around the room's perimeter, as if preparation for some grand ceremony. The 12 tables stood exposed in the darkness, each one active with its own ghostly game. Balls rolled and collided in perfect choreography, following patterns too complex for chance, too purposeful for imagination. And at table 12, the centerpiece of the room, a full rack waited in perfect formation. The 5 antique cues rested against the table's rails, their surfaces gleaming despite decades of age. They seemed to pulse with subtle energy, as if alive, as if aware of my presence. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't music at all. It was invitation. The crowbar felt heavy in my hand as I approached table 12. I could end this now, shatter the cues and break whatever supernatural connection held these champions to the physical world. Or I could pick up a cue, take my position at the table, and finish the game that had waited 70 years for completion. The balls stopped moving throughout the room. In the absolute silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The soft whisper of chalk being applied to a cue tip, the gentle scrape of leather on wood, the subtle shift of feet positioning for a shot. 5 players, taking their places around table 12, waiting for the 6th player to join them. Waiting for me. I set down the crowbar and reached for the nearest cue. Its weight felt familiar in my hands, perfectly balanced, as if crafted specifically for my grip. The humming resumed, softer now, almost welcoming. Around the table I could sense presences, not visible, but undeniably there. Masters of their craft gathered for the conclusion of their greatest game. The break shot waited. I leaned over the table, lined up my shot, and felt the strange certainty that I'd been preparing for this moment my entire life. The building held its breath as I drew back the cue, and somewhere in the darkness, 5 champions who had waited 7 decades for this conclusion urged me forward. The cue ball struck the rack with perfect precision. Whether I ever left that table, whether the museum opened as scheduled, whether anyone found me there the next morning, these questions no longer seemed important. What mattered was the game, the eternal game, and the perfect satisfaction of ivory striking ivory in the endless night. The last sound I remember was applause. Story 6. The smell hit me first. Stale popcorn mixed with ozone and something else I couldn't quite place. Decay, maybe. Or fear. The Wonderland Family Fun Center had been shuttered for 3 years, but the scent of old excitement still clung to the air like cigarette smoke in a cheap motel room. My footsteps echoed through the cavernous space as I made my way past rows of silent arcade cabinets. Pac-Man, Street Fighter, Galaga, ghosts of digital entertainment standing sentinel in the dim emergency lighting. The property management company had hired me to assess the equipment, see what could be salvaged before the demolition crews moved in next month. Simple job, good pay. Should have taken me 2 days max. I set my toolbox down near the central hub where the prize counter used to be. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the building's skeleton crew of lights and the occasional settling creak of old wood and metal. I'd worked in plenty of abandoned places before, dead malls, closed restaurants, bankrupt businesses, but something about this place felt different, expectant. The first machine I approached was a 1981 Defender cabinet. Its side art faded, but still recognizable. I plugged in my equipment and fired it up, watching the familiar boot sequence scroll across the monitor. Everything seemed normal until I inserted a test token. The screen flickered, displaying not the usual attract mode, but a high score list. At the top, in glowing green letters, Marcus K. 999, 999. My name. My initial. I stared at the screen, my mouth suddenly dry. I'd never played this particular machine before. Hell, I'd never even been to this arcade. I pulled out my wallet and checked my license. Marcus Kellerman, K for Kellerman. Coincidence? Had to be. Marcus wasn't exactly an uncommon name, and K could stand for anything. I shook my head and moved to the next cabinet, a Ms. Pac-Man machine with a cracked screen. Same routine. Power up, test token, check functionality. The same thing happened. Marcus K at the top of the high score list, and the next machine, and the next. By the 5th cabinet, a Donkey Kong machine with a mysteriously pristine screen, my hands were trembling as I inserted the test token. The familiar sound of the game starting up filled the air, but instead of Mario beginning his climb, text appeared on the screen. Welcome back, Marcus, ready to finish what you started? Play to the end. The joystick moved under my hand before I'd even touched it. On screen, Mario began climbing the girders without any input from me, dodging barrels with impossible precision. I yanked my hand away, but the character continued moving, completing the first level with perfect timing. Level complete your game is waiting, insert coin to continue. I backed away from the machine, my heart hammering against my ribs. The screen went dark for a moment, then displayed a message that made my blood freeze. We've been waiting for you, don't leave us again. The monitor shut off with a sharp electronic pop, leaving me standing in the dim arcade with only the emergency lighting for company. I pulled out my phone to call the property management company, to tell them I was leaving, that I'd come back tomorrow with backup. But the screen showed no signal, no bars, nothing. I tried moving to different parts of the arcade, holding the phone high, searching for even the weakest connection. Nothing. The device might as well have been a brick. That's when I noticed the other monitors. They were reflecting something that wasn't there. In the dark screens of the dormant arcade cabinets, I could see movement. Shadows shifting, shapes moving through the aisles where no one stood. I turned around, scanning the empty arcade, but saw nothing behind me. When I looked back at the screens, the reflections were gone. I decided to test my sanity. I approached another machine. Centipede, one of my favorites as a kid, and powered it up. As expected, my name appeared at the top of the high score list. But this time, when I inserted the test token, something else happened. The machine began to play itself. The trackball spun without my touch. The fire button clicked rapidly as the on-screen shooter blasted away at descending insects. But more disturbing than the autonomous gameplay was what I saw in the monitor's reflection. Other people, translucent and flickering, crowding around me as if watching over my shoulder. I spun around. Empty arcade. I looked back at the screen. The ghostly audience remained, their faces pressed close to the glass, watching the game with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Some appeared to be adults, others teens, all wearing clothes from different eras. A man in a 1980s windbreaker, a woman with a 1990s spiral perm, a teenager in an early 2000s band t-shirt. The game ended with a perfect score. The screen displayed, "Nice try, Marcus, but you're not playing yet." I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my tools and bolt for the exit. But something else held me in place. A growing certainty that leaving wasn't an option. That whatever was happening here wasn't finished with me. I moved deeper into the arcade, drawn by a sound I couldn't quite identify. A soft electronic melody, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the back corner. I followed it past rows of silent machines until I found the source. A cabinet I'd never seen before, larger than the others, with no recognizable logo or title. Just a simple brass nameplate that read, "The Last Game." The monitor glowed with soft blue light, displaying a simple message: Marcus Kellerman. Age, 34. Occupation, maintenance technician status, ready to play. Below that, a cursor blinked next to a single word. Continue. My personal information stared back at me from the screen. Not just my name and job, but details I'd never told anyone. My birth date, my social security number, the name of my elementary school, my mother's maiden name. Information that had no business being in an arcade game from the 1980s. I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. I'd been in the arcade for about 3 hours. I reached for the joystick, and the moment my fingers made contact, the world around me shifted. The sounds of the empty arcade, the electrical hum, the distant traffic, the settling building, faded away, replaced by something else entirely. Laughter, conversation, the electronic cacophony of dozens of games running simultaneously. The arcade was alive again, not with people I could see, but with their echoes. Shadows moved between the cabinets, transparent forms that seemed more real in my peripheral vision than when I tried to look directly at them. I could hear sneakers squeaking on linoleum, quarters dropping into slots, the frustrated groans of players losing their final lives. But when I turned my head to look, I saw only the empty arcade, dark and abandoned. I looked back at the last game. A new message had appeared. Time is not linear here. Every game ever played, still plays. Every player who ever visited still visits. You are part of the collection. Now the joystick grew warm under my palm. On the screen, a simple maze appeared, like Pac-Man, but wrong somehow. The corridors twisted in impossible geometries, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. A small yellow dot appeared in the center, waiting for my input. I moved the joystick left, and the dot responded. The maze shifted around it, walls sliding and reforming, creating new paths while closing others. With each movement, I could feel something watching me. Not the ghostly arcade patrons, but something else. Something hungry. The deeper I navigated into the maze, the more the real world began to fade. The emergency lighting dimmed until I could barely see beyond the glow of the monitor. The sounds of the phantom arcade grew louder, more insistent. I could smell popcorn again, and spilled soda, and the ozone scent of overworked electronics. I tried to stop playing, to pull my hand away from the joystick, but found I couldn't. My fingers seemed fused to the controls. The yellow dot continued moving through the impossible maze, always forward, never able to turn back. On the screen, text appeared. Almost there, Marcus, Just a little further. I glanced at my watch again. 11:47 p.m., the same time as before. I looked around the arcade and realized with growing horror that the ghostly reflections weren't reflections at all. They were real people, trapped in the screens, playing endless games that never truly ended. Their movements were synchronized with unseen controls, their faces lit by the cold glow of monitors that showed them worlds they could never leave. And now I understood. The arcade wasn't abandoned. It was still open, still operating, just on a different frequency than the rest of reality. Every person who had ever felt truly lost in a game, who had poured their soul into chasing the perfect score, who had found more meaning in digital achievements than real-world success, they were all here, residents of a place where the games never ended and the quarters never ran out. The last game wasn't a machine. It was a doorway. The yellow dot in the maze suddenly stopped moving. On the screen, a message appeared. Final level winner. Takes all, loser stays forever. I tried once more to release the joystick, putting all my strength into pulling away. For a moment, I thought I felt my fingers loosen. But then the controls seemed to meld with my skin, becoming part of me. Around me, the phantom sounds of the arcade grew deafening. I could hear every game that had ever been played here, every victory and defeat, every moment of joy and frustration compressed into a single eternal instant. The ghostly players turned to look at me with hollow, glowing eyes, their faces twisted into expressions of desperate hunger. They wanted out. They needed someone to take their place. I looked at my watch one final time. Still 11:47 p.m. Time had stopped, or maybe I had simply stepped outside of it entirely. The maze on the screen collapsed into a single, straight corridor. At the end, a door marked exit glowed softly. All I had to do was navigate the yellow dot to that door, and I could leave. The game would end. I would be free. But as I guided the dot forward, I realized the terrible truth. The exit door wasn't leading out of the game. It was leading deeper in. The ghostly players weren't trying to escape. They were trying to make room for one more. The yellow dot reached the door. The screen flashed. Game over. Thank you for playing. I felt the joystick release from my grip. The arcade around me flickered like a badly tuned television, shifting between the abandoned shell I'd entered and the thriving family entertainment center it had once been. I was standing in the same spot where I'd started, my toolbox at my feet. The emergency lighting hummed overhead. Everything appeared normal, except for one detail. My watch read 10:47 p.m. I had lost an hour, or gained one. I couldn't be sure. I gathered my tools quickly and headed for the exit, not bothering to power down the machines I'd tested. Behind me, I could hear the soft sounds of the last game starting up again, waiting for the next player to discover it. As I reached the door, I turned back for one final look at the arcade. In the dark screens of the dormant cabinets, I could see my own reflection. But I wasn't alone. Standing behind me, barely visible but undeniably there, was a figure that looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same face, same expression of growing horror. He waved. I didn't wave back. I left the Wonderland Family Fun Center that night, but I can't shake the feeling that part of me stayed behind. Sometimes, when I'm working late in other abandoned places, I catch glimpses of arcade lights in windows that should be dark. I hear the distant sound of electronic music drifting from buildings that have been empty for years. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find myself reaching for joysticks that aren't there, playing games that exist only in the spaces between reality and memory. The property management company called 3 days later. The demolition had been postponed indefinitely. They'd found something unusual in the arcade during the final inspection. Dozens of high-score lists, all featuring the same name, Marcus K. They wanted to know if I'd be available to go back and investigate. I told them I'd think about it. But every night since, at exactly 11:47 p.m., my watch stops for 1 minute. And in that stolen moment, I can hear it calling me back. The sound of quarters dropping into slots, the electronic symphony of a place where the games never truly end. I haven't answered yet, but the hour is getting later, and I'm running out of time to decide whether I'm still playing the game or if the game is playing me. Story 7. The streetlights stretched ahead like fallen stars, each one a small beacon in the suffocating darkness of Meridian Avenue. I shouldn't have been walking home this late. 3 in the morning, the city's dead hour when even the most persistent night crawlers had surrendered to sleep. But the office had demanded its pound of flesh again, another critical data analysis that couldn't wait until morning. And my car had decided to betray me in the parking garage with a symphony of clicking sounds and the acrid smell of something burning. So here I was, David Chen, 32 years old, master of spreadsheets and statistical models, reduced to trudging through the urban wasteland like some modern-day exile. The avenue stretched for 8 blocks, a perfectly straight line of cracked asphalt bordered by sleeping storefronts and the occasional abandoned lot. 8 streetlights marked my path home, each one casting its amber pool against the encroaching night. The first thing I noticed was how my footsteps echoed wrong. Under the first streetlight, everything seemed normal. My shadow fell behind me at the expected angle, a dark silhouette stretched long by the overhead bulb. The familiar weight of my laptop bag pulled at my shoulder, and the October air carried the faint scent of decomposing leaves and distant exhaust fumes. Normal, mundane, safe. But as I moved between the first and second lights, stepping into that corridor of darkness, something shifted in my peripheral vision. There was another shadow, not mine. Mine was still properly positioned behind me, visible whenever I glanced back at the pools of light. This other shadow moved parallel to mine, slightly to the left, mimicking my stride with an almost imperceptible delay. A microsecond lag, like watching a badly synchronized video feed. I stopped. The shadow stopped. I raised my hand to run it through my hair, a nervous habit I'd developed during particularly stressful projects. The shadow raised its hand a fraction of a second later. My rational mind, the part trained to find patterns in chaos, to identify correlations and causations, immediately began constructing explanations. Trick of the light, fatigue-induced hallucination, the interplay of multiple light sources creating optical illusions. I'd been working 16-hour days for the past month. Stress could manifest in countless ways. But as I continued walking, the shadow persisted. Under the second streetlight, it vanished, leaving only my legitimate silhouette projected onto the cracked pavement. Relief flooded through me, accompanied by an embarrassed chuckle. Just tired, just seeing things. The mind playing tricks after too much caffeine and too little sleep. The relief lasted exactly as long as it took to step back into darkness. The shadow returned, and this time it seemed closer. Still to my left, still moving with that unsettling delay, but definitely closer than before. I found myself unconsciously adjusting my pace, trying to throw off its rhythm, but it adapted with each change. Faster, slower, longer strides, shorter steps. The shadow matched them all, always that microsecond behind, as if it was learning. By the third streetlight, my heart was hammering against my ribs. The rational explanations were wearing thin, fraying at the edges like old fabric. I pulled out my phone, thinking the screen's blue glow might provide additional illumination, might reveal the source of my phantom companion. But the screen remained stubbornly black. No signal, battery dead despite being fully charged when I left the office. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the empty street. "Is someone there?" Silence answered, broken only by the distant hum of electrical transformers and the whisper of wind through the skeletal branches of urban trees. No footsteps but mine, no breathing but mine, no heartbeat but mine. Yet the shadow remained, patient and persistent. I decided to run. The decision came suddenly, born of primal fear rather than rational thought. I broke into a sprint, my dress shoes slapping against the asphalt, laptop bag bouncing against my hip. The fourth streetlight rushed toward me, its amber glow promising sanctuary from whatever was pursuing me through the darkness. But the shadow didn't chase me. It anticipated me. As I burst into the pool of light beneath the fourth lamp, the shadow was already there, waiting directly in front of me like a dark prophecy made manifest. Not behind me where shadows belonged, not to the side where it had been stalking me, but ahead, impossibly ahead, where no shadow should exist. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my balance, staring down at the dark outline that perfectly mirrored my silhouette. My chest heaved as I fought to catch my breath, cold air burning my lungs. The shadow remained motionless, a perfect negative space cut from the illuminated pavement. This was impossible. Shadows followed light sources. They didn't predict movement or appear where no body stood to cast them. I was a data analyst, goddammit. I understood cause and effect, input and output, the logical progression of observable phenomena. This defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. But as I stood there, frozen in place, the shadow began to inch toward my feet. Slowly, deliberately, it crept across the pavement like spilled ink seeking a drain. When its edge touched the sole of my right shoe, cold shot through my body like an electric shock. Not the gentle chill of autumn air, but a bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond temperature, beyond physical sensation. And my vision changed. The world inverted itself, colors draining away until everything existed in stark black and white. The streetlight became a pillar of blazing white fire. The pavement transformed into a negative space photograph. Even my own hands, when I held them up in front of my face, appeared as ghostly white shapes against the monochromatic landscape. I jerked my foot back, stumbling away from the encroaching shadow, and the world snapped back to normal color. But something was wrong. Not with the world, but with my memory. I stood under the streetlight, breathing hard, trying to remember why I'd been running, what had frightened me enough to sprint down an empty street in the middle of the night. There had been something. A reason. A threat. But the details slipped away like water through my fingers, leaving only a vague sense of unease and the echo of fear. I shook my head, trying to clear the mental fog. Too much work, too little sleep. I needed to get home, needed to rest. Only 4 more blocks to go. As I stepped away from the 4th streetlight, heading toward the 5th, I became aware of something moving in my peripheral vision. A shadow, keeping pace with me in the darkness between the lights. It seemed familiar somehow, as if I'd encountered it before, though I couldn't quite remember when or where. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Under each streetlight, the shadow vanished, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my growing confusion. Between each light, it returned, closer than before, until I could almost feel its presence like a second skin. At the 6th light, I made the mistake of looking directly at it instead of backing away. The shadow wasn't just mimicking my movements anymore, it was improving on them. When I shifted my weight, it shifted with perfect balance. When I adjusted my grip on my laptop bag, it moved with fluid efficiency. It was becoming a better version of me, frame by frame, movement by movement. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. I stepped forward, deliberately placing my foot in the center of the shadow's outline. The cold hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and sending sharp pains shooting up my leg. The world exploded into negative space, black becoming white, white becoming black, until I felt like I was drowning in inverted light. But this time, something else happened. Memories began to dissolve. Not all at once, but selectively, surgically. I could feel them being erased, like watching someone delete files from a computer. The name of my latest client vanished first, followed by the details of the project that had kept me at the office so late. Then larger chunks, conversations with colleagues, emails I'd written, phone calls I'd made. It was like watching my own mind being edited, my recent experiences wiped clean with the methodical precision of a professional data deletion. Each lost memory left a hollow space, a gap where something important had once lived. I yanked my foot back, gasping, and the process stopped. But the damage was done. I stood under the 6th streetlight, trying to reconstruct why I was here, why I was walking home instead of driving, why my phone was dead and my head felt like it was wrapped in cotton. 2 more lights. 2 more chances for whatever was hunting me to complete its work. I could turn back, retrace my steps, find another route home. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was impossible. Behind me stretched only darkness now, an impenetrable wall of black that seemed to swallow the streetlights I'd already passed. The only way was forward, toward the 7th light, then the 8th, then home, if I could make it that far. If there was still enough of me left to remember where home was. The shadow waited patiently in the darkness ahead, no longer bothering to hide its presence. It had evolved beyond mimicry now, beyond the simple copying of gestures and movements. When I walked, it glided. When I stumbled, it flowed around obstacles with liquid grace. It was becoming something new, something that used my form as a template, but improved upon the design. Under the 7th light, I tried a different approach. Instead of stepping away immediately, I stayed put, studying the phenomenon with whatever analytical skills I still possessed. The shadow appeared whenever I left the direct illumination of the streetlights, suggesting it existed in the spaces between defined light sources. It grew stronger with each encounter, each contact allowing it to absorb more of whatever made me uniquely me. But what was it? A psychological breakdown manifesting as visual hallucinations? Some kind of neurological episode triggered by stress and exhaustion? Or something else entirely? Something that existed in the liminal spaces between belief and reality? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained elusive, especially as more memories continued to fade around the edges. I was losing pieces of myself with each passing moment, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. One more streetlight, one more chance to reach safety, whatever that meant anymore. I stepped into the final corridor of darkness, and the shadow rose to meet me like an old friend. But it was different now, more substantial, casting its own faint luminescence in the space between the 7th and 8th lights. As I watched, it began to separate from the ground, rising into 3 dimensions, taking on depth and weight and presence. It was me, but perfected. Every flaw smoothed away, every hesitation replaced with confidence, every uncertainty transformed into assured purpose. It smiled with my face, but the expression held a coldness I'd never seen in any mirror. "You've been carrying me for so long," it said, and the voice was mine but deeper, richer, more resonant. In every moment of self-doubt, every instance of inadequacy, every time you wondered if you were enough, I'm the version of yourself you never dared to become. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I wanted to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. All I could do was watch as my perfected shadow reached out with hands that looked exactly like mine, but moved with inhuman grace. "Don't fight it," the shadow continued, its fingers inches from my face. "You're tired of being ordinary, tired of being overlooked, tired of being just another data point in someone else's analysis. Let me take over. Let me be what you could never be." The 8th streetlight blazed behind the shadow, so close I could feel its warmth on my face. But between me and salvation stood this thing that wore my appearance like a stolen coat, offering everything I'd ever wanted in exchange for everything I was. I thought about my life, the long hours, the thankless projects, the crushing mundanity of existence as a minor cog in a vast corporate machine. What did I have to lose? What was so precious about my mediocre existence that it was worth preserving? But as the shadow's hand drew closer, I remembered something it had taken, something I'd lost in those moments of contact, the satisfaction of solving a particularly complex problem 3 weeks ago, the simple pleasure I'd felt when the data finally revealed its pattern. It was a small memory, insignificant to anyone else, but it was mine. It was human. It was imperfect and precious and real. I dove sideways, rolling across the pavement, scrambling toward the 8th streetlight on hands and knees. The shadow pursued me, no longer bothering with human locomotion, flowing across the ground like liquid mercury. I could feel it reaching for me, cold fingers brushing against my ankles, trying to drag me back into the darkness. But I made it. I collapsed under the 8th streetlight, gasping, my clothes torn and my hands scraped bloody from the pavement. The shadow stopped at the edge of the light, unable or unwilling to pursue me further. For a moment, we stared at each other across the boundary between illumination and darkness. Then it smiled, my smile, but wrong, and began to fade. Next time, it whispered as it dissolved. There's always a next time. The streetlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. I was alone on the empty street, surrounded by the familiar sounds of urban night. In the distance, I could see my apartment building, its windows glowing with the warm light of home. I picked myself up, dusted off my clothes, and started walking. My laptop bag felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't quite remember why I'd been working so late, or why my car wasn't in its usual parking spot. The details seemed unimportant now, fuzzy around the edges like a half-remembered dream. As I walked the final block home, I noticed my shadow trailing behind me in the streetlight's glow. Normal, predictable, perfectly ordinary in every way. But sometimes, when I moved between the pools of light, I thought I caught a glimpse of something else in my peripheral vision. Something patient. Something waiting. Something that looked exactly like me, but better. I told myself it was just fatigue, just stress, just the mind playing tricks after a long day. And maybe it was. Maybe it always had been. But I've started taking different routes home now, avoiding Meridian Avenue entirely. And on the nights when I do find myself walking alone in the dark, I make sure to stay in the light. Because some shadows, once they've tasted what you are, never stop hunger for what you could become. Story 8. The asphalt stretched endlessly ahead, slick with that peculiar dampness that night roads seem to absorb from nowhere. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight. The conference in Denver now just a blur of PowerPoint presentations and stale coffee. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m., and my eyelids felt heavy with the kind of fatigue that makes everything beyond the headlight beams seem to dissolve into black static. That's when I first noticed the box truck. It appeared gradually in my peripheral vision, an ancient thing with rust bleeding through white paint like old wounds. The vehicle moved with an odd, labored rhythm, as if its engine was fighting against some invisible resistance. What struck me immediately was how it seemed to hover just at the edge of my consciousness, present but not quite there, like a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to form. I checked my rearview mirror out of habit. Nothing. The road behind me stretched empty, marked only by the yellow dashes that seemed to pulse in the reflection of my own taillights. Yet when I glanced at my side mirror, there it was, that weathered truck maintaining a steady distance, its single working headlight casting an uneven glow across the center line. The sensible thing would have been to pass it and move on. Highway 50 through Kansas had always been desolate, but tonight it felt different, oppressive in a way that made my skin crawl with inexplicable awareness. Still, sitting behind a vehicle that could barely maintain 50 miles per hour wasn't an option. I had another 4 hours of driving ahead, and fatigue was already making the road seem to shift and breathe at the edges of my vision. I pressed the accelerator and pulled into the left lane. The truck didn't appear in my rearview mirror as I drew alongside it. This should have been my first warning, but exhaustion has a way of making the mind accept impossibilities as mere quirks of perception. I told myself the angle was wrong, that the truck's position created a blind spot in the internal mirror's limited field of view. The side mirrors showed it clearly enough, a hulking presence that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I pulled ahead, something cold settled in my stomach. The cab was dark, completely dark, as if no one sat behind the wheel. Yet the truck maintained its steady pace, following some invisible track down the highway with mechanical precision. I accelerated harder, eager to put distance between myself and whatever was guiding that empty vessel through the night. The mile markers became my anchor to reality after that. Each green sign that flashed past in my headlights marked progress, proof that I was moving forward, leaving whatever strangeness I'd encountered far behind. Mile 247, mile 248, mile 249, then mile 249 again. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks with my perception. But there it was, clear as the painted lines beneath my tires. Mile 249. The same faded numbers, the same slight lean to the left where the post had settled unevenly into the Kansas soil. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I passed mile 249 for the third time. The road felt solid beneath my tires, the engine hummed with its familiar vibration, and the speedometer showed a steady 75 miles per hour. Yet something fundamental had broken in the relationship between motion and progress, as if I'd become trapped in a loop of repeating geography. That's when the radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched the dial since leaving Denver, content to drive in silence through the vast emptiness of the plains. But now static filled the car, punctuated by fragments of voice that seemed to emerge from very far away. I reached for the tuning knob, but froze as the words became clear. Anyone out there? Can anyone hear this? I'm on Highway 50, eastbound past mile marker 249. Something's wrong with my car, with the road. I think I'm... The voice cut off abruptly, leaving only the hiss of empty airwaves. But I recognized those words, that tone of growing panic. I recognized the voice itself, though I couldn't immediately place where I'd heard it before. There was something familiar about the cadence, the slight rasp that came from too much coffee and too little sleep. The transmission repeated several minutes later, identical in every detail. Same words, same inflection, same sudden cutoff. But this time, as I listened with growing unease, I understood why the voice seemed so familiar. It was my own. I was hearing my own voice broadcast across the radio waves, speaking words I had never said, describing a situation I was only now beginning to experience. The delay was perhaps 5 minutes, as if some invisible recorder was capturing my thoughts and broadcasting them back to me through the static-filled darkness. I reached for the radio again, then stopped. If that voice was truly mine, if somehow my own words were being transmitted back to me, then touching the radio might confirm what my rational mind refused to accept. Better to pretend it was coincidence, a stranger with a similar voice caught in a similar predicament somewhere else along this endless stretch of highway. But deep down, I knew the truth was far more disturbing. Mile 249 passed again, and again. The green sign had become a metronome marking time in a place where time had lost all meaning. I began to count the repetitions, desperate for some anchor in a reality that seemed to be dissolving around me. 7th time, 8th, 9th. That's when I saw the truck again. It appeared suddenly in my rear mirror, close enough that I could make out individual rust spots on its corroded bumper. Too close. The thing had somehow caught up without me noticing, and now it rode my tailpipe with an intimacy that made my spine crawl. I checked the rearview mirror. Still nothing. The road behind me remained empty, stretching back into darkness. But the side mirrors told a different story. They showed the truck maintaining its impossible proximity, its single headlight boring into my consciousness like a malevolent eye. I pressed the accelerator, but the truck matched my speed effortlessly. When I slowed, it slowed. When I changed lanes, it followed with mechanical precision. Worse, something was happening to its appearance that made my vision swim with vertigo. The single taillight was multiplying. At first, I thought it was just a trick of perspective, the way lights can seem to double when you're tired. But as I watched in growing horror, the red glow began to spread across my field of vision. One light became 2, then 4, then 8. They arranged themselves in a perfect line stretching across both lanes of the highway, creating a corridor of crimson illumination that pulsed with organic rhythm. The lights weren't just multiplying, they were growing brighter, more intense, until they dominated my mirrors and cast an hellish glow throughout the interior of my car. I found myself unable to look away, hypnotized by their synchronized pulsing. They seemed to be guiding me forward, demanding that I maintain my speed, warning me never to stop. And still the radio continued its periodic broadcasts of my own voice, growing more desperate with each repetition. I think something's following me. There's a truck, but it doesn't show up in all my mirrors. The lights. Jesus, the lights are everywhere now. I can't stop. Every time I try to slow down, they get brighter. Someone has to be hearing this. Someone has to... The transmission cut off, but not before I heard something that made my blood freeze. In the background, barely audible beneath my own panicked words, was the sound of another voice. Not mine. Something else, speaking in a language I couldn't identify, using tones that didn't seem quite human. I realized with sudden clarity that I had never spoken those words into any radio. I hadn't used the radio at all since leaving Denver, yet somehow, my voice was being broadcast across the airwaves, describing experiences I was living in real time. The delay suggested I was hearing my own future, words I would speak in situations I hadn't yet encountered. But if that was true, then the other voice in the background, what did that represent? The answer came to me with the force of revelation, terrible and undeniable. I wasn't hearing recordings of my own transmissions. I was hearing someone else's voice, shaped and modulated to sound exactly like mine. Something was using my voice, broadcasting false distress calls into the night, perhaps to lure other travelers into the same impossible loop that had trapped me. The thought galvanized me into action. I reached across the car and grabbed the small blanket I kept in the passenger seat for emergencies. If the truck only appeared in my mirrors, then perhaps eliminating the mirrors would eliminate the truck itself. With one hand on the wheel, I managed to drape the blanket over the rearview mirror, blocking my view of the road behind. The effect was immediate and disturbing. The red lights vanished from my peripheral vision, and the oppressive sense of being followed lifted like fog burning off in morning sun. I covered the side mirrors as well, using my jacket to block the passenger side, and adjusting the driver's side until it showed only the ceiling of the car. For the first time in what felt like hours, I was alone on the highway. Mile 250 passed outside my window, then 251, then 252. Progress had returned. Time had resumed its forward motion. The truck was gone, banished to whatever realm of impossibility had spawned it. I laughed with relief, a sound that echoed strangely in the enclosed space of the car. But my celebration was short-lived. The radio crackled again, but this time the transmission was different, cleaner, more purposeful, and the voice that emerged from the speakers was definitely not my own. Package acquired, it said in tones that carried no trace of human emotion. Subject has eliminated visual confirmation protocols, initiating direct approach, coordinates locked, ETA, 3 minutes. The transmission ended, leaving me in silence that felt suddenly hostile. Package acquired, subject. Those weren't words you'd expect to hear on an emergency frequency. They sounded clinical, militaristic, as if I'd somehow stumbled into the middle of an operation I wasn't supposed to witness. But the most terrifying part was the mention of coordinates. Whatever was speaking knew exactly where I was. The mirrors might have hidden the truck, but they hadn't hidden me. I checked the mile markers with growing panic. 253, 254, 255. The numbers continued their steady progression, but now they felt like a countdown. 3 minutes, the voice had said. 3 minutes until what? That's when I noticed the lights in the distance. They weren't the red tail lights of the phantom truck. These were white and bright, approaching from ahead at tremendous speed. At first, I thought it might be another vehicle, perhaps a semi-truck cresting a hill. But as the lights grew closer, I realized they were moving far too fast for any terrestrial vehicle. They covered miles in seconds, closing the distance with predatory efficiency. The speedometer on my dashboard began to fluctuate wildly, the needle swinging between 0 and maximum, despite the fact that my foot remained steady on the accelerator. The engine note changed too, developing a rhythm that didn't match the feel of the road beneath my tires. It was as if the car was responding to commands I wasn't giving, following instructions broadcast from somewhere beyond my control. I tried to turn off the highway, but discovered that the steering wheel had become unresponsive. My hands could move it freely, but the car continued straight ahead, locked onto Highway 50 like a missile following a guidance beam. The approaching lights grew brighter, illuminating the road signs and fence posts with clinical clarity. Mile 256, mile 257, mile 258. And still the lights approached, now close enough to resolve into distinct shapes. Not headlights at all, but something else entirely. They moved in formation, maintaining precise distances from each other, pulsing with the same organic rhythm I'd observed in the truck's multiplying taillights. The radio crackled once more, but now the transmission was continuous, no longer broken by static or delay. Subject approaching intersection point. Vital signs elevated, but stable. Memory integration will commence upon contact. Previous subjects have shown minimal resistance once neural pathways are accessed. Beginning final approach sequence. I understood then that I had stumbled into something far worse than a supernatural encounter. This wasn't a ghost story or a psychological breakdown. This was an abduction, carried out by entities that had been using my own voice to lure others into the same trap. The truck, the repeating mile markers, the radio transmissions, all of it had been designed to confuse and contain, to keep me driving until their own vehicles could intercept. The lights were now close enough to cast shadows, and in those shadows I could see shapes that didn't quite make sense. Angular geometries that seemed to shift and flow despite their apparent solidity. Surfaces that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. My last clear memory before the lights reached me was of checking the odometer. It read exactly 50,000 miles, though I distinctly remembered it showing 47,831 when I'd left Denver. Somehow, during my endless repetitions of mile marker 249, I had traveled over 2,000 miles without moving at all. The implications of that discrepancy followed me into the light, where thought became difficult and memory began to fragment like glass subjected to impossible pressures. But even as consciousness faded, I retained enough awareness to understand that I would soon be speaking into a radio again, using my own voice to guide other travelers toward the same intersection of highway and impossibility. The last thing I heard was my own voice, broadcast from somewhere far ahead on the road I had yet to travel. Anyone out there? Can anyone hear this? I'm on Highway 50, eastbound past mile marker 249. Something's wrong with my car, with the road. I think I'm being followed, and in the background, barely audible beneath the familiar words, other voices were speaking in languages that predated human civilization, discussing coordinates and acquisition protocols, and the systematic harvesting of memory from travelers who would never reach their intended destinations. The lights engulfed my car, and Highway 50 continued its eternal stretch through the Kansas darkness, waiting patiently for the next driver who would notice an old truck that didn't appear in rearview mirrors, and wonder why the mile markers had begun to repeat the same numbers over and over again. Somewhere in the static between radio stations, voices continue to broadcast distress calls in familiar tones, each one a perfect replica of someone who once drove through the night and discovered that some roads lead to destinations that don't appear on any map. Story 9. The Whitmore Memorial Library had stood for 137 years, its red brick facade weathered to the color of dried blood, its Gothic windows staring down at me like hollow eyes as I fumbled with the brass keys on that first morning. I'd taken the night janitor position out of desperation. 3 months unemployed will make a man accept any work, even cleaning the dusty corridors of a building that most folks avoided after dark. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, had been curt during my brief orientation. The building closed at 9 p.m., she'd explained, and my shift began at 10. Simple enough. Vacuum the reading rooms, empty the trash, dust the shelves, and ensure everything remained in perfect order for the morning patrons. What she hadn't mentioned was how the place breathed differently at night, how shadows seemed to pool in corners that stayed bright during the day, or how the building's settling groans sounded distinctly like footsteps when you were alone on the upper floors. I discovered the shoe prints on my third night. They appeared on the polished hardwood of the second-floor corridor, a neat line of perfect impressions leading from nowhere and ending just as abruptly. The leather soles had been recently polished. I could tell by the way they caught the dim overhead lighting, reflecting it back like dark mirrors. Each print was precisely placed, as if the walker had measured each step with a ruler. Oxford style, size 10 or 11, with that distinctive pattern of small holes across the toe that marked expensive footwear. I followed them with my flashlight beam, counting 23 prints total. They began exactly 6 feet from the mathematics section and ended precisely 4 feet before the philosophy shelves. No dust disturbed the floor before the first print. No residual marks lingered after the last. Just those 23 perfect impressions, as if someone had materialized, walked exactly that distance, then simply stopped existing. That first night I convinced myself I'd missed them during my initial sweep. Perhaps a patron had lingered after closing, sneaked past Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye. The explanation felt flimsy even as I told myself the story, but I mopped the prints away and continued my rounds. They returned the next night. Same corridor, same path, same polished precision. This time I examined them more carefully, crouching with my flashlight to study the depth and clarity. The impressions were fresh, the wood still slightly depressed in perfect sole patterns. I placed my own work boot beside one for comparison. Mine left a barely visible mark on the waxed floor, while these prints seemed pressed into the wood itself, as if made by someone carrying tremendous weight. I began documenting them. Each night I'd find the same path, sometimes with minor variations, 24 prints instead of 23, or ending a foot closer to the philosophy section. But always the same corridor, always the same polished Oxfords, always that impossible appearance with no beginning or end. By the second week I'd started staying late to watch. I'd positioned myself in the astronomy section with the lights dimmed, flashlight ready, waiting for whoever made those prints to reveal themselves. Night after night I'd sit among the star charts and constellation guides, listening to the building's nighttime symphony of creaks and sighs, watching the corridor with growing obsession. It was on the 9th night of my vigil that I saw the trouser hem. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The shadows seemed thicker than usual, pooling between the shelves like spilled ink. I'd been watching for nearly 3 hours when something moved at the far end of the corridor, just a flutter of dark fabric disappearing behind the poetry section. Navy blue linen, expensive looking, pressed to sharp creases. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept closer, flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. The poetry section stood against the north wall, its shelves packed tight with volumes from floor to ceiling. I examined the space behind it, barely 8 inches between the bookshelf and the wall, far too narrow for any person to squeeze through. Yet I'd seen that fabric disappear precisely there. I pressed my face against the gap, shining my light into the narrow space. Dust motes danced in the beam, and I caught the faint scent of something I couldn't identify, not musty books or old wood, but something cleaner, like freshly laundered fabric and expensive cologne, the kind of subtle, sophisticated scent that lingered in the wardrobes of men who could afford hand-tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. Over the following nights, the sightings multiplied. A glimpse of navy fabric sliding behind the history section. The suggestion of a trouser cuff vanishing into the impossibly narrow space behind religious texts. Always that same dark blue linen, always disappearing into gaps where no human could fit. I started mapping these appearances, sketching rough diagrams of which sections seemed to attract the mysterious visitor. A pattern emerged. All the sightings occurred along the library's circulation paths, the main corridors that connected different sections, as if something was indeed circulating through the building, moving along invisible routes that only it could navigate. The thought should have been absurd, but I'd begun to notice other details that chilled me. Books that shifted positions overnight, always old volumes with leather bindings and gilt lettering. I'd find them moved from their proper places, relocated to reading tables or different shelves entirely. And always, without fail, they'd be open to the same chapter. Let him pass. The first time I found one of these displaced books, I assumed some patron had been reading and forgotten to close it, but the chapter heading made my skin crawl. Let Him Pass appeared in a 1923 volume of supernatural folklore, open to a section about appeasing restless spirits. The next night, a different book, this time a 1890 collection of local legends, lay open to an identically titled chapter about granting safe passage to wandering souls. I began researching these books during my off hours, spending my mornings in the library as a patron rather than an employee. The Let Him Pass chapters appeared in dozens of volumes, all written in different decades by different authors, yet all containing essentially the same content: instructions for allowing trapped spirits to complete their eternal journeys. According to these sources, some souls become caught in locations where they'd spent significant portions of their lives, doomed to repeat familiar patterns until someone grants them permission to move on. The spirits weren't malevolent, merely persistent, growing more insistent over time until they achieved their goal of unrestricted movement through their chosen domain. Mrs. Henderson noticed my research and made pointed comments about employees who spent too much time in the building. Her disapproval stung, but I couldn't abandon my investigation. The nightly encounters had become the focus of my existence, and I sensed some approaching crescendo that would demand action on my part. The breakthrough came during my 4th week. I'd been watching the philosophy section when multiple trouser hems appeared simultaneously, 5 or 6 distinct flickers of navy fabric vanishing behind different shelves along the corridor. For the first time, I detected movement that suggested coordination, as if several figures were moving in formation rather than a single entity appearing in multiple locations. But that realization paled beside what I discovered when I returned with the lights fully illuminated. Every book in the philosophy section had been disturbed. Dozens of volumes sat slightly askew, pulled forward just enough to create small gaps behind them. And in each gap, barely visible unless you knew to look, lay a small object. A brass button, a cufflink, a piece of navy thread. Personal effects, as if someone had been brushing against the shelves while moving through impossibly narrow spaces. I gathered these objects in a small box, studying them under the break room's fluorescent lights. Quality items, all of them. The buttons bore the mark of a high-end tailor. The cufflinks were real gold, engraved with initials I couldn't quite make out. The fabric threads matched perfectly the navy linen I'd been glimpsing in the corridors. That night, for the first time, I spoke aloud to whatever shared my nocturnal hours. "I know you're here," I whispered to the darkened corridors. "What do you need from me?" The response came not as words, but as a sudden proliferation of the phenomena. Trouser hems appeared at both ends of every corridor simultaneously, creating the impression of a gathering crowd moving just beyond my perception. The scent of cologne intensified until it filled the entire floor. And in the reading room, I found 17 different books open to Let Him Pass chapters, arranged in a precise circle around the central table. The message was unmistakable. Whatever inhabited this place was growing more desperate, more insistent. The polite haunting of my first weeks was transforming into something more urgent, more demanding. I knew what I had to do. The philosophy section's shelving unit stood on casters, designed to be moved for deep cleaning. I'd noticed the wheels during my first week but hadn't given them much thought. Now I understood their purpose. These shelves were meant to be relocated, creating temporary passages through spaces that normally remained blocked. It took me an hour to clear the shelves, moving hundreds of volumes to temporary locations. Another hour to shift the massive unit itself, rolling it slowly across the hardwood floor until a 3-foot gap opened between the shelving and the north wall. The space beyond wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of the narrow gap I'd imagined, I found myself looking into a hidden corridor that ran parallel to the main library hallways. The passage was perhaps 4 feet wide, with finished walls and the same hardwood flooring as the rest of the building. Dust lay thick on every surface, but I could see footprints in that dust. The same Oxford impressions I'd been finding each night, now revealed in their original context. The hidden corridor extended in both directions, presumably connecting to similar passages throughout the building. A secret circulation system, designed by architects who'd understood that a great library needed more than its public pathways. This was how rare books could be moved without disturbing patrons, how maintenance could occur without disruption, how the building's true caretakers could perform their duties unseen. I stepped into the passage, flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. The air smelled of old wood and that persistent cologne, stronger here than anywhere else. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the narrow space amplified and distorted sound. 20 feet along the passage, I found him. He stood with his back to me, perfectly motionless, dressed in a navy linen suit that looked freshly pressed despite the thick dust covering everything else in the hidden corridor. His polished Oxford shoes gleamed in my flashlight beam, reflecting the light like dark mirrors. Dark hair, neatly trimmed, with just a touch of silver at the temples. He didn't turn when I approached, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. Yet I felt certain he knew I was there, had perhaps been waiting decades for someone to discover this passage and grant him the freedom he sought. I reached out to touch his shoulder, to speak to him, to offer whatever assistance he needed. My fingers passed through him like smoke. But as my hand moved through the space his body seemed to occupy, I caught something solid. A brass nameplate that hung in the air where his jacket pocket should have been. The metal was warm to the touch, engraved with crisp lettering that my flashlight revealed clearly. Cornelius Whitmore, head librarian, 1887-1924. The building's founder, the man whose name graced the memorial plaque in the main lobby, who'd designed these secret passages for purposes I was only beginning to understand. He'd been the library's true caretaker, spending 37 years ensuring its smooth operation, and apparently he'd never left. I placed the nameplate carefully on a small shelf built into the corridor wall, clearly designed for such purposes. As soon as the brass touched wood, the figure before me seemed to relax, his rigid posture softening into something more natural. For the first time, he turned to face me. His features were exactly as I'd imagined, dignified, intelligent, with the bearing of a man accustomed to responsibility and respect. He nodded once, a gesture of profound gratitude, then began walking deeper into the hidden passage. His footsteps made no sound, but I could track his movement by the slight displacement of dust motes in the air. I followed at a respectful distance as he moved through his secret domain, noting how the hidden corridors connected every section of the library, how small alcoves held supplies and equipment, how the entire system had been designed to allow unobtrusive maintenance and care. This was Cornelius Whitmore's masterpiece, not just the library itself, but this invisible infrastructure that kept it functioning perfectly. At the passage's end, a narrow staircase descended to what I assumed was a similar system on the ground floor. Whitmore paused at the top of these stairs, looking back at me one final time. His mouth moved as if speaking, though I heard nothing, but I thought I could read his lips forming two words. "Thank you." Then he descended the stairs and vanished into the depths of his eternal rounds. I sealed the passage behind me, moving the philosophy shelves back into their original position. The hidden corridor once again became invisible, accessible only to those who knew its secret, but I left the nameplate where I'd placed it, a small shrine to the man who'd never stopped caring for his life's work. The shoe prints still appear each night, but now they follow different patterns. Instead of ending abruptly, they continue in logical circuits that connect all sections of the library. The displaced books still move, but they're returned to their proper places rather than left on reading tables. And sometimes, very rarely, I catch the scent of cologne drifting through the main corridors, not trapped and desperate anymore, but free and content. Mrs. Henderson has complimented me on the building's improved condition. Fewer books are misfiled now, she says. The dust accumulates more slowly. Even the temperature seems more consistent throughout the building. I never mention that I'm not the only one maintaining the library. Some responsibilities transcend death, and some dedication never ends. Cornelius Whitmore continues his rounds, granted at last the freedom to move through his domain without obstruction. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone on the upper floors, I wonder if I truly freed him, or if I simply became part of his eternal circulation. The thought doesn't frighten me anymore. After all, there are worse fates than spending forever caring for something you love. And when my own time comes to join that timeless patrol, I suspect I'll understand why some souls choose never to pass beyond the places that shape them. The Whitmore Memorial Library has room for all its faithful caretakers, living and otherwise. The books will always need tending, and someone must ensure they never stop circulating. Story 10. The Meridian Club closed at midnight, but the real work began afterward. I'd been pulling closing shifts for 3 months, ever since Marcus quit without notice, and I'd grown accustomed to the particular silence that settled over the Art Deco dining room once the last patron departed. The geometric patterns in the carpet seemed to shift in the amber glow of the banker's lamps, and the mahogany panels reflected my movements like a funhouse mirror. But it was table 20 that had begun to unsettle me, not because of what happened there during service, but because of what happened after. The first time I noticed it, I'd been collecting forgotten napkins and clearing water glasses from the emptied tables. Table 20 sat in the corner beneath the mezzanine staircase, positioned so that diners could admire the intricate ironwork spiraling upward toward the second floor that had been closed for renovation since before I started working here. I'd cleared the table thoroughly, stacked the chairs, and moved on to polish the bar. When I glanced back 20 minutes later, one of the water glasses had shifted 6 inches to the left. I told myself I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks during those late hours when the building settles and the heating pipes tick like Morse code through the walls. But the next night, it happened again. This time, a cloth napkin had been folded into the shape of a rose, its peaks and valleys precise as origami. By the 3rd week, I'd started keeping a mental inventory of Table 20's contents before I moved to other tasks. Water glass, salt shaker, small vase with dried flowers, all positioned exactly as I'd left them. Yet invariably when I returned, something had changed. The salt shaker would be rotated 45 degrees. The vase would be centered instead of offset. Once I found all 4 napkins arranged in a perfect star pattern around the table's center. I mentioned it to Dave, the night manager, but he just shrugged and suggested the building's old foundation was causing the floor to shift. When I pointed out that none of the other tables experienced similar phenomena, he gave me a look that suggested I might be working too many late shifts. That's when I decided to document it. On a Tuesday in October, after the last customer had departed and Dave had locked himself in the office to count receipts, I positioned myself at the bar with a clear view of Table 20. I'd brought a small notebook and planned to record the exact time and nature of any disturbances. The dining room felt different that night, more charged, as if the air itself held its breath in anticipation. At 12:47 a.m., the water glass began to move. Not a sudden shift, but a gradual slide across the white tablecloth, leaving no condensation trail. I wrote down the time, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to capture the details. The glass stopped moving after traveling approximately 8 inches, now positioned at what would be the customary spot for a diner's right hand. At 1:03 a.m., the napkin folded itself. This time I watched the entire process, my pen frozen over the notebook page. The cloth seemed to respond to invisible fingers, creasing and tucking until it resembled a lily. The precision of the fold suggested practiced hands, someone familiar with the art of table presentation. At 1:15 a.m., I heard the footsteps. They began as a whisper of leather against wood, so faint I initially mistook them for the building settling. But the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. Someone was climbing the mezzanine stairs that led nowhere, terminating at a landing blocked by construction barriers and plastic sheeting. The footsteps reached the top landing and stopped. From my position at the bar, I could see the wrought iron railing that bordered the mezzanine's edge. Nothing moved in the shadows above, yet I felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed. The air in the dining room grew thick, pressing against my eardrums like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I forced myself to continue watching Table 20, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. The chair facing away from the kitchen, the one that would provide a diner with the best view of the room, began to shift. Not the violent scraping of wood against floor, but a gentle settling, as if someone of substantial weight had just eased into the seat. The cushion depressed by exactly the amount it would under a seated person. My notebook entry for 1:22 a.m. reads only, "Someone sitting down." I remained frozen at the bar for another 10 minutes, watching the indented cushion, listening to the silence that had replaced the footsteps. The logical part of my mind supplied explanations. Settling foundation, atmospheric pressure changes, my own exhaustion creating hallucinations. But logic felt thin and inadequate in the face of what I was witnessing. At 1:35 a.m., I made a decision that I still question. I approached table 20. Each step across the dining room floor echoed despite my attempts at stealth. The geometric patterns in the carpet seemed to pulse beneath my feet, and the scent of jasmine, a perfume no one had worn in the restaurant that evening, grew stronger as I drew closer. When I reached the table, I could see the chair's occupant clearly. There was no one there, yet the cushion remained compressed, the armrests positioned as if hands gripped them lightly. I pulled out the chair opposite the invisible diner and sat down. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a presence so palpable it raised the hair on my arms. Across from me, the air shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. I could feel eyes upon me, patient and expectant. Without thinking, I reached for the water pitcher I'd left on the service station and poured a glass, placing it carefully in front of the empty chair. The glass lifted immediately. I watched it rise 6 inches from the table surface, tilt at the precise angle necessary for drinking, and pause there for several seconds before lowering again. When it touched the tablecloth, it was noticeably lighter, the water level reduced by exactly the amount a normal person might consume in a single sip. My hands moved of their own accord, setting out silverware, a bread plate, a second napkin. Each item was acknowledged, the fork lifted and examined, the napkin unfolded and draped with careful precision. I found myself falling into the rhythm of service, anticipating needs I couldn't see but somehow understood. The presence felt familiar, like serving a regular customer whose preferences I'd memorized over months of interaction. Medium rare steak, no vegetables, extra butter for the bread. A preference for sitting with his back to the wall, watching the room. Someone who tipped generously but never spoke unnecessarily. When I finally stood to leave nearly an hour later, I felt a compulsion to speak aloud. The words emerged without conscious thought. "Same time tomorrow, sir?" The chair cushion shifted slightly, as if its occupant had nodded. I spent the remainder of my shift in a daze, mechanically completing my closing duties while my mind struggled to process what had occurred. By the time I left the Meridian Club at 3:30 a.m., I'd almost convinced myself the entire episode had been a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much coffee. That conviction lasted until the next morning. I arrived for my shift at 4 p.m. to find an envelope tucked beneath the reservation book at the hostess station. My name was written on the front in elegant script, the kind of handwriting they used to teach in finishing schools. Inside was a bank check dated October 15th, 1938, made out to me personally in the amount of $50, more than I made in a week. The signature line bore my own name, written in the same careful script as the envelope. I stared at the check for a full 5 minutes, turning it over in my hands, examining the watermark and the bank's elaborate logo. Everything about it appeared authentic, from the slight yellowing of the paper to the way the ink had faded at the edges. But the date was impossible. 1938 was decades before I was born, and the signature, while unmistakably my name, was written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Yet the more I studied it, the more familiar that handwriting became. I slipped the check into my wallet and tried to focus on preparing for the evening service, but questions gnawed at me throughout the night. During my break, I researched the bank listed on the check header. Continental Trust had been a prominent institution in the 1930s, with a branch just 6 blocks from the Meridian Club. The bank had closed in 1943, its assets absorbed by a larger financial company that no longer existed. The check shouldn't have been possible, yet there it was, crisp and real, in my wallet. That night, after the last customer departed, I positioned myself at table 20 without hesitation. The routine was identical: footsteps on the mezzanine stairs, the settling of an invisible weight into the chair, the patient expectation that filled the air like humidity. But this time, when I served water and set out silverware, I also placed the check on the table between us. The paper rustled without any visible cause, lifted and examined by unseen hands. I could sense consideration, perhaps approval, before the check was carefully returned to its original position. Then, from the mezzanine above, came a sound I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure: the slow, deliberate applause of someone clapping their hands. The sound echoed through the empty dining room for exactly 7 beats before stopping. When I looked down, a second check lay beside the first. This one was dated October 16, 1938, the day after the first check. Same amount, same bank, same impossible signature, but the memo line, which had been blank on the previous check, now contained a single word written in that familiar script: retainer. I understood then that I was being offered a permanent position, not as an employee of the Meridian Club, but as personal service staff for a patron whose appetite extended beyond the normal hours of operation. Someone who had been dining alone at table 20 for far longer than the restaurant had been in business, who required only the most basic courtesy, water, silverware, and the acknowledgement that his presence was both real and valued. The checks represented more than payment. They were a contract, a binding agreement that would ensure the patron's continued satisfaction in exchange for what appeared to be generous compensation. But the signature troubled me. How could someone who existed in 1938 know my name, write it in handwriting that looked increasingly like my own? Unless the signature wasn't a coincidence. I left the checks on the table and spent the rest of my shift avoiding the dining room, focusing instead on cleaning the kitchen and organizing storage areas. But I could feel the presence waiting, patient as only the dead can be patient, expecting a decision. By morning, both checks had vanished. The pattern continued for the next week. Each night I would find an envelope containing a check dated 1 day later than the previous, each signed with my name in that increasingly familiar script. Each night, I would serve the invisible patron, maintaining the pretense of normal hospitality while trying to understand the nature of our arrangement. The handwriting on the checks was definitely becoming more familiar. Not just similar to mine, but identical in ways that suggested muscle memory, the particular slant and pressure that comes from years of practice. Looking at the signatures was like examining my own hand in a mirror. Everything was exactly as it should be, yet fundamentally wrong. On Halloween night, exactly 1 week after receiving the first check, I made my decision. Instead of placing the latest check on the table for the patron's inspection, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my wallet alongside the others. 7 checks now, representing a week's worth of impossible payments from a customer who shouldn't exist. The dining room felt different as I approached table 20. The air crackled with tension, and the shadows beneath the mezzanine stairs seemed deeper, more substantial. When I took my seat across from the invisible patron, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath formed small clouds as I waited for acknowledgement that never came. The silence stretched for 20 minutes before I finally spoke. I accept the position. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every table in the dining room shifted simultaneously, chairs scraping against the floor in a cacophony that should have brought Dave running from the office. Light fixtures swayed despite the absence of any breeze, and the temperature plummeted until I could see my breath clearly in the amber glow of the banker's lamps. From the mezzanine above came the sound of footsteps, not ascending this time, but descending toward the dining room floor. I didn't turn around to watch. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the water glass across from me, watching it rise and fall in what appeared to be a toast. When I lifted my own glass to complete the gesture, the water tasted like champagne, bubbling and effervescent on my tongue. The footsteps stopped directly behind my chair. I felt pressure on my shoulders, hands resting there with the weight of familiarity, as if this gesture had been repeated countless times before. The hands were neither warm nor cold, but substantial enough that I could feel the texture of gloves through my shirt. When the hands lifted, I knew the contract was sealed. The checks in my wallet had changed. The dates now range from 1938 to 1945, but the handwriting had evolved with each successive year, becoming more confident, more recognizably mine. The final check, dated December 31st, 1945, bore a signature that was absolutely identical to my own. Not similar, but perfect down to the smallest flourish. I understood then that time at the Meridian Club moved differently after midnight. That the patron I'd been serving wasn't a ghost from the past, but something far more complex. A presence that existed in the spaces between moments, in the hours when normal rules no longer applied. And I understood that the name on those checks wasn't a coincidence or supernatural knowledge. It was a preview, a glimpse of who I would become after enough nights spent serving table 20, after enough time in the presence of something that fed on routine and courtesy, and the willing suspension of disbelief. The checks were signed by me, but by a version of myself that existed 7 years in the future of 1938. A future that was somehow also my past, a temporal loop that ensured the patron would never lack for service. I am writing this account on my final morning at the Meridian Club, though I suspect final is the wrong word. Tomorrow I begin my permanent shift, the one that exists in the hours between midnight and dawn, serving a single customer who pays an impossible currency and expects nothing more than basic human courtesy. The checks are real. I've verified this by attempting to deposit one at 3 different banks. Each teller examined the document with growing confusion, unable to explain why their computers recognized the account numbers from a bank that closed decades ago, or why the routing numbers appeared valid despite being formatted in a system that didn't exist in 1938. But the most unsettling part isn't the supernatural banking, or the invisible patron, or even the gradual realization that I've somehow signed a contract with my own future self. It's the handwriting. Each morning, I practice signing my name, and each morning, the signature looks more like the one on those checks. The changes are subtle, a slight adjustment in the way I form the letter G, a new flourish on the final N, but cumulative. My handwriting is evolving to match the impossible signatures, as if I'm being trained to become the person who wrote them. Tonight, when I serve table 20 for what I believe will be the last time during normal hours, I expect to receive one final check. This one will be dated with today's date, in today's year, and it will be signed in handwriting that is unmistakably, undeniably mine. Because I am both the server and the patron, separated by decades but united by the simple act of providing service to someone who has been waiting patiently for longer than should be possible. The Meridian Club closes at midnight, but for me, the real work is just beginning. Story 11. The first thing Sergeant Morrison told me about the night watch wasn't about the perimeter checks or the radio protocols. It was about the rubber balls. "Always keep a pocket full," he said, fishing a handful of colorful spheres from his cargo pants. They looked like something you'd find in a grocery store dispenser, bright blues and reds that caught the harsh fluorescent light of the briefing room. Old tradition, been going on since this place was operational. I took the offered handful, feeling their smooth surfaces roll against my palm. They were heavier than expected, dense with some kind of filling that shifted when I squeezed them. Morrison's weathered face showed no hint of humor, just the practiced indifference of a man who'd seen too many rotations come and go. "What's the tradition exactly?" I asked. Morrison's eyes flicked toward the window that overlooked the abandoned warehouses. "You'll figure it out." That was 3 weeks ago. Now, standing at the edge of Sector 7 with my flashlight cutting through the October darkness, I understood what he meant. The base had been decommissioned for 15 years, but the Army still maintained a skeleton crew to monitor the sealed storage facilities. Most contained equipment too expensive to move, too outdated to use, and too classified to dispose of properly. The night air carried the metallic taste of rust and the sweet decay of leaves that had been falling since before I arrived. My footsteps echoed off the corrugated metal walls of Warehouse C, the sound bouncing back distorted and hollow. The facility's grid of floodlights had failed systematically over the years, leaving pools of yellow illumination separated by expanding zones of shadow. I'd made it halfway through my first round when I heard it. Laughter. Not the deep belly laugh of adults sharing a joke, but something higher, more musical. It seemed to drift from somewhere inside Warehouse D, though that was impossible. The building had been sealed with industrial locks and warning tape for over a decade. I stopped walking and listened, my breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. The sound came again, a cascade of giggles that seemed to echo from multiple sources, as if several people were sharing some private amusement just beyond the metal walls. My radio crackled with static, and I almost called it in before remembering Morrison's warning about false alarms. New guards were expected to have a rough first month. Reporting phantom sounds wouldn't earn me any credibility. I continued the patrol, but the laughter followed me. Not constantly. It would fade for minutes at a time, letting me convince myself I'd imagined it. Then, just as my pulse began to settle, it would return, always seeming to originate from whichever building I was passing. By the time I completed the circuit and returned to the guard station, my uniform was damp with sweat despite the October chill. Morrison was waiting with coffee and that same impassive expression. "Heard anything interesting?" he asked. I hesitated, studying his face for any sign of setup. Some sounds from the warehouses, probably just whined through the vents. He nodded slowly. Probably. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out another handful of rubber balls. "Might want to top off your supply." The second night was worse. The laughter started earlier this time, beginning almost as soon as I left the station. It had a quality that made my skin crawl. Not malicious exactly, but wrong somehow. Like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. I found myself walking faster, then catching myself and forcing a steady pace. Guards who lost their nerve didn't last long in any assignment, let alone one where you spent 8 hours alone with abandoned buildings and your own imagination. I was passing Warehouse E when something changed. The heavy metallic sound of sliding bolts echoed through the night, followed by the grinding shriek of metal on metal. I spun toward the sound, flashlight beams sweeping across the warehouse's sealed entrance. The doors were still closed, but I could swear I heard them moving, a rhythmic clanging like someone testing the locks from inside. That's when I remembered the rubber balls. My hand went to my pocket automatically, fingers closing around the familiar spheres. Morrison's words echoed in my mind. Old tradition. Without really thinking about it, I pulled one out, a blue ball that seemed to glow under my flashlight. The laughter had stopped. Even the wind had died, leaving in silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I looked over my shoulder, though I couldn't say why, and tossed the ball backward without watching where it landed. The effect was immediate. The grinding of metal ceased. The laughter faded to nothing. The night seemed to exhale, tension flowing out of the air like water from a broken dam. I completed the rest of my patrol in blessed quiet, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following just outside the reach of my flashlight. When I returned to the station, I found Morrison reviewing paperwork with unusual intensity. "Everything quiet tonight?" he asked without looking up. "Mostly." He glanced at my pocket, noting the slight bulge was smaller than when I'd left. His nod seemed approving, but he offered no explanation. By the end of the first week, the routine had become automatic. The laughter would start somewhere in the second hour of my shift, building gradually until it seemed to come from all directions at once. Then the metallic sounds would begin, bolts sliding, hinges creaking, the deep bass rumble of heavy doors straining against their locks. The moment I threw a rubber ball over my shoulder, everything would stop. I never looked to see where the balls landed. Something instinctive warned me against it. The phenomenon wasn't random. I began to recognize patterns in the timing, the intensity, the specific sounds. The laughter always preceded the mechanical noises by exactly 3 minutes. The volume would peak just before I threw a ball, as if whatever was causing it could sense my growing discomfort. Most unnervingly, the balls I threw never bounced. I could hear them hit the ground with a soft thud, but I never heard them roll or settle the way dropped objects should. Morrison continued to resupply me without comment, and I stopped asking questions. The base's day shift guards seemed normal enough, career military types who treated the assignment as semi-retirement. But none of them worked nights, and none of them mentioned rubber balls or strange sounds. When I tried to bring it up casually during shift changes, the conversation would somehow drift to other topics. I started keeping count, 10 balls on average per shift, sometimes more if the sounds were particularly persistent. Morrison's supply seemed inexhaustible, but I began to wonder about the logistics. Where did he get them? How long had this been going on? What happened to guards who didn't follow the tradition? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. 3 weeks into the assignment, something changed. I was midway through my patrol when the familiar laughter began, but it sounded different, more focused somehow, as if directed specifically at me rather than simply emanating from the buildings. The usual pattern was disrupted too. Instead of building gradually to the mechanical sounds, the laughter continued for nearly 10 minutes, rising and falling in waves that seemed almost conversational. I found myself slowing, then stopping entirely as I tried to understand what I was hearing. The sounds had a rhythm, a cadence that reminded me of children playing games in a schoolyard. But there were no children on the base. There hadn't been children here for 15 years. The thought struck me with surprising force. Had there ever been children here? I realized I knew almost nothing about the base's operational history. Morrison had mentioned it was decommissioned, but he'd never said what its original purpose was. I'd assumed it was standard military storage, but what if it had been something else? What if families had lived here once, officer housing with children who played in these same spaces? The laughter grew louder, more insistent. I reached for a rubber ball but hesitated. For the first time since I'd started the job, I wanted to know what would happen if I didn't throw it. The metallic sounds began right on schedule, 3 minutes after the laughter started. But instead of the usual grinding of bolts and hinges, I heard something new. Footsteps. Soft, rapid footsteps that seemed to circle the perimeter of Warehouse F. They moved with the quick, light rhythm of someone running in play rather than flight. My hand tightened on the rubber ball, but I didn't throw it. The footsteps multiplied. Soon it sounded like a dozen people moving around the building, their pace increasing as they picked up some kind of game. The laughter rose to match it, becoming less musical and more urgent. Still I waited, flashlight beam trained on the warehouse's sealed entrance, waiting to see what would emerge. That's when the doors began to move. Not opening. The locks and security tape remained intact, but the massive metal panels were shifting, bowing outward as if something inside was pressing against them with enormous force. The sound was like thunder, deep bass notes that I felt in my chest as much as heard. The laughter reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache. I threw the ball. Silence hit like a physical blow. The doors snapped back to their normal positions. The footsteps vanished mid-stride. Even my own breathing seemed muted in the sudden quiet. But as I stood there, heart hammering against my ribs, I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. The rubber ball I'd thrown, I could see it, about 20 feet behind me, glowing faintly blue under my flashlight beam. It sat perfectly still on the cracked asphalt, exactly where it should have bounced and rolled. Except it was dissolving. The ball was melting like ice cream on hot pavement, but instead of leaving a puddle, it simply disappeared. The dissolution started at the bottom and worked upward, edges becoming translucent before vanishing entirely. In less than 30 seconds, there was nothing left but a dark stain on the concrete that looked disturbingly like a burn mark. I stared at the spot for a long time before continuing my patrol. Morrison was waiting with the usual handful of rubber balls. But this time I paid attention to his face as he handed them over. There was something in his expression I hadn't noticed before, not just indifference, but a kind of resigned weariness. The look of a man carrying a burden he couldn't share. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. He considered the question for a long moment. 15 years, give or take. Since the base was decommissioned? Since the last incident. I waited for him to elaborate, but he'd already turned back to his paperwork. The conversation was over. That night, I started with only 8 rubber balls in my pocket. I'd taken Morrison's usual offering, but I'd also started testing something. I wanted to know how much of my supply was really necessary. The laughter began on schedule, but I waited longer before responding. I let the mechanical sounds build to their peak, let the pressure in the air become almost unbearable before finally throwing a ball. The relief was the same, but the aftermath felt different. Instead of the usual complete silence, I thought I could hear something else. A soft sighing sound, like wind through autumn leaves, or like someone exhaling in disappointment. The pattern held for 3 more nights. I could stretch the intervals, let the disturbances build longer before responding, but eventually I always had to throw a ball. The alternative felt somehow dangerous, though I couldn't articulate why. It was like standing too close to the edge of a cliff. The rational mind knew what would happen if you fell, even if you'd never actually tested it. On the fourth night, disaster struck. I was down to my last rubber ball, a red one that felt slightly different from the others, heavier and warmer to the touch. The usual sequence had played out, but as I reached back to throw it, the ball slipped from my fingers. I heard it hit the asphalt behind me and immediately spun around to retrieve it. The ball was dissolving. Just like the one I'd seen before, it was melting away in accelerating dissolution, but this time, I was watching it happen, and I could see what was causing it. The asphalt around the ball was smoking, giving off thin tendrils of acrid vapor that made my eyes water. The concrete itself was being eaten away, leaving a perfectly circular hole about 6 inches deep. Whatever was causing the balls to disappear, it was still there, still active, still hungry. The laughter resumed immediately, but it sounded different now, closer, more immediate. The mechanical sounds followed, but instead of the familiar grinding of warehouse doors, I heard something new. The heavy metallic clang of the guard station's entrance. I turned toward the building and saw my worst nightmare coming true. The reinforced door was sliding shut, its electronic locks engaging with a series of heavy clicks. I ran toward it, but I was 50 yards away and the door was moving fast. By the time I reached the entrance, I was locked out of the only secure building on the entire base. My radio was inside. My backup supplies were inside. My only means of communication with the outside world was inside. The laughter surrounded me now, coming from every direction at once. It no longer sounded playful or musical. There was an edge to it that made my skin crawl, a note of triumph that suggested something had finally gone according to plan. I pressed my back against the locked door and tried to think. The shift wouldn't end for another 5 hours. Morrison wouldn't arrive until dawn. I had no rubber balls left, no way to appease whatever presence haunted this place, and no means of escape. The footsteps began again, but this time they weren't confined to the warehouses. I could hear them moving across the open areas, circling closer with each pass. My flashlight seemed dimmer somehow, its beam struggling to penetrate the thickening darkness. Or maybe the darkness was getting thicker on its own. As I stood there, listening to the approaching footsteps and trying not to panic, a horrible thought occurred to me. What if the rubber balls weren't an offering? What if they were a distraction? What if I'd been feeding something all this time, keeping it satisfied with small meals while it waited for something bigger? The footsteps stopped directly in front of me. I couldn't see anything in the beam of my flashlight, but I could feel a presence there, something watching me with patient, alien intelligence. The laughter had stopped too, replaced by a silence so complete it made my ears ring. Then, just at the edge of my hearing, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice. Human, but wrong somehow. The words distorted as if spoken through water or thick glass. "No more candy," it said. "Time to play." I don't remember much of what happened next. There are fragments, running between the warehouses, the beam of my flashlight swinging wildly across familiar structures that somehow looked different in the darkness. The sound of my own breathing, harsh and ragged. The sensation of being herded, guided along specific paths by an intelligence I couldn't see or understand. I remember finding myself at the center of the base, surrounded by the warehouses in a perfect circle. I remember the laughter resuming, but multiplied now, as if dozens of voices had joined the original sound. I remember the ground beneath my feet beginning to vibrate, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from far below. And I remember the moment when everything suddenly stopped. Morrison found me the next morning, unconscious beside the guard station door. According to his report, I'd apparently passed out from exhaustion and exposure. The door's electronic lock had malfunctioned, trapping me outside for most of the night. Mechanical failure, nothing more. I didn't argue with his version of events. He offered me a transfer to day shift, and I accepted immediately. I've been working days for 3 months now, and I've never heard laughter or footsteps or the grinding of metal doors. The other guards treat me normally, though I sometimes catch them watching me with expressions I can't quite read. Morrison still works nights. He still carries rubber balls in his pockets. When I ask him about finding a replacement for the night watch, he just nods and says he's working on it. Sometimes, when I'm leaving at the end of my shift and he's arriving for his, I see him looking at me with that same resigned weariness, the look of a man carrying a burden he can't share. But lately I've been wondering about something else. What if the burden isn't the job itself? What if it's the knowledge of what happens to guards who can't handle it? What if Morrison has been doing this for 15 years not because he wants to, but because he's the only one left who can? I've started paying attention to personnel records, looking for information about previous night guards. The files go back decades, but there are gaps, periods where no one seems to have been assigned to night duty at all. And when I try to access the older records, the ones from before the base was decommissioned, I keep getting security clearance errors. I don't know what this place was before it became a storage facility. I don't know what happened here 15 years ago that made Morrison start carrying rubber balls, and I don't know what would have happened to me if I'd run out of them on any night other than the one I did. But I know one thing with absolute certainty: whatever haunts this place, it's still hungry. And sooner or later, Morrison is going to need help feeding it. The question is whether the next guard will be strong enough to handle the tradition, or if they'll become part of whatever it is that laughs in the darkness between the warehouses. I hope I never find out, but I suspect I will. Story 12. The detour sign appeared in my headlights like a pale accusation against the October darkness. 23 years driving interstate buses, and I'd never seen construction on this stretch of Highway 47. The orange reflectors seemed to pulse with each sweep of my wipers, directing me onto a narrow access road that curved away from everything familiar. I should have turned around right then. The passengers behind me, a handful of late-night travelers bound for Memphis, shifted in their seats as the bus lurched onto the unfamiliar asphalt. Through my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of their silhouettes. The college kid with his laptop still glowing, the elderly woman clutching her purse, the businessman whose phone screen cast blue shadows across his tired features. Normal people living normal lives, trusting me to deliver them safely to their destinations. The road stretched ahead like a black tongue, unmarked and seemingly endless. My GPS had gone silent 5 minutes ago, its screen showing only a blank gray void where the map should be. The radio crackled with static, occasionally breaking into fragments of distant stations before dissolving back into white noise. That's when I saw the bus stop. It materialized out of the darkness like something half-remembered from a dream. A simple wooden bench beneath a flickering streetlight that cast more shadows than illumination. The sign above it bore no route numbers, no destination names, just a blank metal rectangle that reflected my headlights back at me like a dead eye. A figure stood beside the bench, motionless as a photograph. Even from 50 yards away, I could make out the gray overcoat that hung loose around his frame. The dark hat pulled low over features I couldn't quite distinguish. In his left hand, he gripped a leather satchel that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the feeble light. Protocol demanded I stop. Company regulations were clear about picking up passengers at designated stops, even ones I'd never seen before. But something deep in my gut twisted as I downshifted, the bus's air brakes hissing like a dying breath. The figure approached with measured steps, each footfall echoing against the pavement with unnatural clarity. Up close, the shadows beneath his hat brim seemed deeper than physics should allow, creating a void where his face should be. When he climbed aboard, the bus's interior lights dimmed perceptibly, as if his presence drew illumination into itself. He moved past me without a word, without even the customary nod most passengers offered. The leather satchel remained clutched in his grip, never shifting, never relaxing. I watched him select a seat 3 rows back, settling into the worn upholstery with deliberate precision. "That'll be $12.50 to Memphis," I said, my voice sounding stranger than it should in the confined space. He raised one gloved hand, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal, and I found myself releasing the brake before I'd consciously decided to move forward. The fare could wait until later, I told myself. Company policy could bend for one night. We returned to the main road, or what I assumed was the main road. The asphalt looked the same, felt the same beneath the bus's tires, but something indefinable had changed. The landscape outside my window seemed flatter somehow, stretched thin like a photograph that had been enlarged beyond its resolution. Even the stars looked different, fewer and more distant, as if the sky itself had grown larger while we drove. Behind me, the passengers began to settle into the rhythm of late-night travel. Conversations faded to whispers, then to silence. One by one, their breathing deepened into the regular cadence of sleep. The college kid's laptop screen went dark. The elderly woman's purse slipped from her loosening fingers. The businessman's phone tumbled into his lap, its screen black and lifeless. I should have felt relieved. Sleeping passengers were easier passengers, especially on the long hauls. But as I glanced into my rearview mirror, something made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The seats beside each sleeping traveler were no longer empty. A dense gray mist had begun to coalesce in the vacant spaces, pooling and swirling like fog-given substance. As I watched, transfixed and horrified, the vapor began to take shape, suggesting the outline of seated figures, the curve of shoulders, the tilt of heads. They appeared to be passengers themselves, riding alongside the living in perfect, terrifying silence. My hands trembled against the steering wheel as I forced my attention back to the road. The speedometer showed 65, but the landscape outside crawled past with dreamlike slowness, as if we were moving through water rather than air. The white lines on the asphalt seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made my eyelids feel heavy. I shook my head violently, biting down on my tongue until I tasted copper. The sharp pain cleared the fog from my thoughts, but when I checked the mirror again, the misty figures remained. If anything, they seemed more solid now, more defined. I could almost make out facial features in their vapor-wreathed forms, expressions of patient waiting that chilled me more than any scream could have. The man in the gray overcoat sat motionless in his chosen seat, the leather satchel balanced precisely on his knees. When I tried to focus on his reflection, my eyes seemed to slide away, as if some part of my brain refused to process what it saw. But I was certain he was watching me, could feel the weight of his hidden gaze like a cold hand pressed against the back of my neck. I reached for the radio, desperate to establish contact with the outside world, to prove to myself that reality still existed beyond the confines of this nightmare journey. My fingers found only static, an endless wash of white noise that seemed to echo from somewhere far deeper than any earthly radio tower. The road ahead began to curve, banking gently to the left in a wide arc that should have brought us back toward familiar territory. But instead of recognizing landmarks, I found myself staring at terrain that belonged in no geography I knew. The flat farmland had given way to rolling hills covered in trees that appeared to be leafless despite the early autumn season. Their branches reached toward the sky like gnarled fingers, creating a canopy of shadows that seemed to move independently of any wind. My watch showed 3:17 a.m., but the display flickered as I looked at it, the digital numbers warping and reforming in patterns that hurt to contemplate. Time itself seemed negotiable here, subject to rules I didn't understand. Behind me, someone stirred. I glanced back to see the college kid shifting in his sleep, his features peaceful despite the impossible circumstances surrounding him. The misty figure beside him actually turned, to regard the movement with what might have been curiosity. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the vapor-wreathed head tilt in a gesture that was heartbreakingly human. I tried to call out, to wake the passengers and shatter whatever spell had settled over the bus. But when I opened my mouth, no sound emerged. The gray-coated man had raised his hand again, the same gesture he'd made when boarding, and I found my voice trapped in my throat like a stone. The satchel in his lap seemed to pulse with subtle movement, as if something living stirred within its leather confines. A faint hissing sound filled the air, not the mechanical wheeze of the bus's systems, but something organic and rhythmic, like the breathing of some vast, unseen creature. The mist began to thicken, spilling from the occupied seats and pooling in the aisles. It rose slowly, creating layers of gray vapor that obscured my view of the passengers. Within those shifting clouds, I glimpsed movement. the suggestion of forms that walked between the seats, checking on the sleepers with maternal concern. My speedometer began to fluctuate wildly, the needle swinging between 30 and 90 without any corresponding change in the bus's actual speed. The engine's rumble deepened to a bass note that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. Through the windshield, the road ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, a black ribbon that curved away into dimensions my mind couldn't properly process. I realized with growing horror that I no longer controlled the bus's direction. The steering wheel turned beneath my hands, guiding us along paths that existed outside normal space. We were passengers now, all of us, traveling through territories mapped by older rules than physics or reason. The gray-coated man's presence filled the bus like a perfume of winter nights and abandoned places. When I dared to glance at him again, I saw that the satchel had opened slightly, revealing an interior that seemed to extend far deeper than its outer dimensions should allow. Within that impossible space, I glimpsed movement, the flutter of countless small forms, like moths made of shadow and size. We passed a road sign, its surface blank except for a single symbol that my eyes refused to focus on properly. Beyond it, the landscape began to change again, the skeletal trees giving way to vast fields of tall grass that swayed without wind. In the distance, structures that might once have been buildings stood in various states of architectural impossibility, their angles wrong in ways that made my head ache to consider. The passengers slept on, their breathing synchronized now with the rhythm of whatever lived in the open satchel. The misty figures beside them had grown more solid, more present, until I could no longer distinguish which were real and which were vapor-born companions. They all seemed equally substantial, equally there, in this place where the normal rules had been suspended. My fuel gauge showed empty, but the engine never faltered. The odometer had stopped advancing, frozen at a number I didn't recognize from when we'd started this journey. Time and distance had become negotiable concepts, subject to revision by forces beyond my understanding. The radio crackled suddenly, and through the static came a voice, my own voice, speaking words I had never said. Route terminated. All passengers must disembark. Please ensure you have all your belongings. I looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the announcement, but the gray-coated man was watching me now, his hidden face turned in my direction with unmistakable attention. The satchel lay fully open on his lap, revealing depths that seemed to contain their own weather systems, their own geography of impossible spaces. The bus began to slow, though I hadn't touched the brakes. Outside, a new bus stop appeared, identical to the one where we'd picked up our mysterious passenger, down to the flickering streetlight and blank metal sign. But this one stood alone in a landscape I didn't recognize, surrounded by the swaying grass and the wrongly angled buildings. The passengers began to wake, their movements sluggish and dreamlike. One by one, they gathered their belongings and filed toward the front of the bus, their faces serene and empty of recognition. They moved past me without acknowledgement, as if I had become as insubstantial as the misty figures that had accompanied them. The college kid paused at the top of the steps, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. For a moment, his eyes cleared, and he looked directly at me with an expression of profound confusion. "I don't remember getting on this bus," he said, his voice hollow and distant. Then he was gone, stepping down into the strange landscape beyond the door. The elderly woman followed, then the businessman, each carrying their possessions into the swaying grass as if heading home after a perfectly ordinary journey. The gray-coated man was the last to rise. He moved toward the front of the bus with the same measured steps he'd used when boarding, the satchel now closed and secured in his grip. At the top of the steps, he paused and turned toward me, raising his free hand in what might have been a farewell or a summons. "Your route continues," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through empty places, of doors closing on familiar rooms. "But the fare must be collected." I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand explanations for everything that had happened. But the words died in my throat as he stepped down from the bus and walked away into the tall grass, his gray form gradually becoming indistinguishable from the shifting shadows of that impossible landscape. The door closed with a pneumatic sigh, and I found myself alone on a bus that felt larger than it should. traveling a road that led through territories no map had ever charted. The speedometer showed 65, but I couldn't tell if we were moving forward or backward, up or down, through space or time or some dimension that encompassed all possibilities. In the rearview mirror, the bus stop receded into the distance, taking its passengers into whatever destiny awaited them in that place beyond normal geography. I was returning to the familiar world, or so I told myself. But something essential had been left behind in that exchange. Some part of myself now walked in the tall grass with the others, while what remained continued this eternal journey along roads that existed only in the spaces between sleeping and waking. The radio crackled back to life, playing a song I almost remembered from a time I might have lived. The GPS screen flickered and showed my location as a question mark floating in digital void, and ahead of me, the road stretched on toward destinations that might or might not exist, carrying me forward through a night that had no dawn, on a route that would never truly end. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the windshield, I see a gray overcoat draped across my shoulders and feel the weight of a leather satchel that I don't remember picking up. Sometimes I hear the breathing of passengers who aren't there, riding along in seats that shimmer with heat mirage and possibility. And sometimes, late at night when the highway is empty and the radio plays nothing but static, I wonder if I ever really left that place at all, if I'm still driving through those impossible landscapes, collecting fares from passengers who board at stops that exist only in the margins of reality, carrying them to destinations that wait beyond the edge of every map ever drawn. The route continues. It always continues. And somewhere in the distance, another driver is approaching a detour sign that gleams like bone in the headlights, leading toward a road that promises to take them exactly where they need to go. Story 13. The brass nameplate on my security desk reads, Harold Mackenzie, 30 years of service. But tonight, it feels more like a tombstone marker than a celebration. The university handed out plaques this morning, posed me for photos with the dean, even mentioned my dedication to campus safety in the newsletter. What they don't mention is that for 3 decades, I've been the only one willing to take the graveyard shift patrolling the service tunnels beneath Morrison Hall. Most guards last 6 months before requesting transfers. They cite the dampness, the maze-like layout, the way sounds carry and echo until you can't tell if footsteps are your own or someone else's. But I've grown accustomed to the tunnel's peculiarities, their musty breath and the way shadows seem to shift just beyond my flashlight's reach. Tonight, though, something feels different. The air tastes metallic, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. The tunnels stretch beneath the entire east wing of campus, a sprawling network of concrete arteries built during World War II when the university served as a civil defense training facility. Originally designed as air raid shelters, they were abandoned after the war ended, deemed unnecessary and too expensive to maintain. Now they house utility lines, storage, and the occasional drunk student who wandered too far from the main buildings. My radio crackles with static as I descend the metal stairs into the main corridor. The emergency lighting strips cast everything in sickly yellow, creating more shadows than they eliminate. I've walked these tunnels thousands of times, but tonight, my footsteps sound different. Heavier, like they're being absorbed by the walls themselves. The first inscription appears about 50 yards down the main passage, scratched into the concrete with something sharp. The letters are crude, uneven, as if carved by unsteady hands. Happy anniversary. I stop, sweeping my flashlight beam across the wall. The words weren't there yesterday. I'm certain of it. In 30 years, I've memorized every crack, every stain, every piece of graffiti students have left behind. This is new. My throat tightens. Who would know about my anniversary? The plaque ceremony was internal, just department heads and a photographer from the campus paper. I continue walking, telling myself it's coincidence. Maybe some student's birthday party got out of hand down here. 20 feet further, another message appears in the same scratchy handwriting. Come through the echo. The words seem to pulse in my flashlight beam. The scratch is deeper here, more violent. I reach for my radio, muscle memory from 3 decades of protocol, but the static that greets me is wrong. Too rhythmic, almost musical. I adjust the frequency dial, but the sound doesn't change. It reminds me of something, a tune I can't quite place. The air grows colder as I move deeper into the tunnel system. My breath starts forming small clouds, which shouldn't be possible. The tunnels maintain a constant temperature year-round, insulated by tons of earth and concrete. I've never seen my breath down here, not even during the coldest winters. Another inscription appears around the next bend. We've been waiting. The letters are larger now, more confident. They seem to follow the natural curve of the wall, as if whoever wrote them knew exactly how the corridor would bend. My hands start trembling, and I grip the flashlight tighter. The beam wavers across the concrete, and for a moment, I swear I see additional words forming in the shadows between my movements. But when I hold the light steady, there's nothing but blank wall. I should turn back. Every instinct developed over 30 years of security work tells me to retreat, call for backup, file a report about vandalism in the tunnels. But something pulls me forward, a compulsion I can't explain. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's the stubborn pride that kept me in these tunnels when every other guard fled. Or maybe it's something else entirely. The static from my radio begins to change, becoming more structured. I hold it closer to my ear, straining to make sense of the sound. There's a pattern emerging, something almost like voices, distant, distorted, but definitely human. They seem to be singing. Another message comes into view. 30 years of echoes. This one is different. The letters are cleaner, more deliberate, carved with precision rather than frantic scratching. Below it, in smaller text, herald my name. My actual name, not Harry, like everyone calls me, not Mac, like it says on my uniform. Harold, the name my mother used, the name on my birth certificate and nowhere else in this building. I stumble backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The radio static resolves into something unmistakable now. The melody of Happy Birthday to You, sung by what sounds like a children's choir. But the voices are all wrong. Too deep, too slow, stretching each note until it becomes something mournful and horrible. The tempo drags like a record player running out of power. Happy birthday to you. The words echo through the tunnel, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spin around, trying to locate the source, but the sound bounces off the walls, multiplying and distorting until I can't tell which direction it's coming from. Happy birthday to you. I run. Professional dignity abandoned, 30 years of training forgotten. I sprint back toward the entrance, but the tunnel stretches before me, longer than it should be. The distance I covered in 10 minutes now seems to require 20, 30. The walls appear to be moving, subtly expanding the space between me and escape. Happy birthday, dear Harold. The voices are closer now, keeping pace despite my desperate flight. The emergency lighting flickers and dims, sections going dark in sequence like dominoes falling. I'm running through pools of yellow light separated by growing stretches of absolute darkness. My flashlight begins to fail, the beam growing weaker with each step. The batteries were fresh this morning. I always change them at the start of my shift, but the light fades to a dim orange glow, barely illuminating the ground in front of my feet. Happy birthday to you. The final verse begins as complete darkness swallows the tunnel. The only light comes from my dying flashlight and the faint red glow of the exit sign somewhere impossibly far ahead. The children's voices grow louder, more distinct, as if they're walking beside me in the darkness. But they're not children's voices, I realize. Not anymore. They're too deep, too knowing. They sound like children might sound if they'd been singing for decades, their voices aging and distorting while their words remained eternally young. The walls start to pulse with a rhythm that matches the song. The concrete itself seems to breathe, expanding and contracting like the inside of lungs. With each pulse, the tunnel grows longer, stretching like taffy being pulled. The exit sign bobs in the distance like a ship on a dark ocean. I feel eyes watching me from the darkness between the failing light strips. Not seeing, there's nothing to see in this blackness, but feeling. The weight of attention, focused and patient and utterly alien. Something has been waiting in these tunnels for 30 years, waiting for this anniversary, this moment when the barriers between what is and what might be grow thin. My radio crackles one final time, and through the static I hear my own voice speaking words I never said. Harold Mackenzie, final patrol log. All clear in the tunnels. Nothing unusual to report. The children's song reaches its crescendo, dozens of voices that shouldn't exist singing in perfect harmony. The tunnel walls begin to close behind me like a zipper being pulled shut, concrete flowing like liquid, sealing the passage I just traveled. The red exit sign grows brighter but no closer, a beacon in an ever-expanding darkness. I understand now why the other guards left, not because of dampness or echoes or shifting shadows. They left because they could sense what I've ignored for 30 years. These tunnels are alive. They remember the people who sheltered here during the war, the fear and hope and desperate prayers whispered in the darkness. They've been feeding on those memories, growing stronger, waiting for someone to stay long enough to become part of the foundation. The song ends. Silence falls like a curtain, absolute and suffocating. My flashlight dies completely, leaving me in darkness so complete it has weight and texture. The exit sign flickers once and goes out. But I'm still running, my feet finding purchase on concrete that may or may not be there, in a tunnel that stretches endlessly into tomorrow. Behind me, the walls continue their inexorable advance, sealing away 30 years of faithful service, creating a new section of the maze for the next guard to patrol. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, I think I see another message scratched into a wall I haven't reached yet. Welcome home, Harold. And for the first time in 30 years, I'm not sure I want to reach the end of my patrol. The next morning, the university maintenance department discovered that Harold Mackenzie had never showed up for his shift. His security desk remained undisturbed, radio charged and ready for use. The tunnel system beneath Morrison Hall appeared exactly as it had for decades, showing no signs of recent activity. A new guard was hired by the end of the week. She lasted 6 months before requesting a transfer, citing the dampness, the maze-like layout, and the way sounds carried and echoed until you couldn't tell if footsteps were your own or someone else's. The tunnels continue to wait. Story 14. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as I pushed through the sliding glass doors of St. Catherine's emergency room at 3:17 a.m. 23 sleepless hours had carved hollows beneath my eyes, and my reflection in the entrance glass looked more like a question mark than a man. The waiting room stretched before me like an abandoned theater, rows of blue plastic chairs facing a reception desk that seemed to float in the antiseptic brightness. My sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as I approached the intake window. The sound echoed strangely in the empty space, as if the walls were holding their breath. Through the thick glass, I could see movement. Someone shuffling papers, the soft click of keyboard keys. A small placard read, "Please take a number and wait to be called." I pulled ticket number 47 from the dispenser, though I couldn't imagine who numbers 1 through 46 might have been. The slip felt unnaturally warm between my fingers. Sleep had become my enemy somewhere around day 4 of this current bout. The insomnia struck in waves, sometimes allowing me a few hours of fitful rest before snatching it away like a cruel magician. This time was different, though. This time my body felt like it was running on pure electricity, every nerve ending hypersensitive to the slightest stimulus. The sound of my own heartbeat had become deafening in the silence of my apartment. I settled into a chair near the middle of the waiting area, far enough from the entrance to avoid the periodic whoosh of the automatic doors, close enough to the desk to hear when they called my number. The chair's fabric was rough against my palm, and I found myself picking at a loose thread while watching the reception area. That's when I noticed the voice. "Number 47, it called, crisp and professional. I stood, surprised at how quickly they'd gotten to me, and approached the desk. Behind the glass sat a man in his 30s, clean-shaven with short brown hair and tired eyes. He wore the standard blue scrubs of the hospital staff, and his name tag read, "David Patient Services." His smile was wide and persistent, stretching across his face like it had been painted there. "Number 47, the voice called again. I turned toward the sound and felt my step falter. To my left, behind an identical window, sat another man. The same man. Same brown hair, same scrubs, same name tag. But this David wasn't smiling. His eyes were flat and lifeless, staring at something beyond my shoulder with the expression of someone watching paint dry. The smiling David gestured for me to approach his window. The other David said nothing, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I stood between them, feeling like I was watching some kind of elaborate practical joke. "How can I help you tonight?" the smiling David asked, his grin never wavering. I glanced back at the other David, who remained motionless as a mannequin. I'm having trouble sleeping. Chronic insomnia. My doctor said I should come in if it got worse." Of course. Smiling David nodded enthusiastically. "We see this all the time. Night shifts, you know? Everyone has trouble with night shifts." I wanted to tell him I wasn't working any shift, that I was unemployed and hadn't slept properly in nearly a week, but the words felt thick in my throat. Instead, I found myself nodding along. "Just need you to fill out some paperwork," smiling David continued, sliding a clipboard through the slot in the glass. Standard stuff. The clipboard was heavier than it should have been, and the papers clipped to it were blank except for a series of numbers running down the margins. No form fields, no medical questions, just columns of ascending numbers that seemed to go on forever. "This doesn't look like..." "Mr. Harrison?" The voice came from my right, and I turned to see a third David emerging from a door I hadn't noticed before. This one looked exactly like the others but wore different scrubs. Darker, navy blue instead of the standard light blue. His expression was neutral, businesslike. "If you could follow me," he said, gesturing toward the door he'd emerged from. "We have a consultation room ready." I looked back at the two Davids behind the glass. Smiling David was still grinning, though his eyes had taken on a glassy quality. Dead-eyed David hadn't moved an inch. The clipboard in my hands felt warm, almost hot. "Actually, I think I'll wait out here," I said, setting the clipboard on the counter. "I'm not in any rush." Navy David's expression didn't change. "The consultation room is more private, better for discussing sleep issues." There was something about the way he said sleep issues that made my skin crawl, like he was talking about a terminal diagnosis rather than insomnia. I shook my head and took a step back toward the waiting area. "Mr. Harrison," he said again, and this time his voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I spun around, but Navy David was still standing in the same spot. Smiling David was still smiling. Dead-eyed David was still staring. But I could swear I heard my name being repeated, echoing from the corridors that led deeper into the hospital. "Harrison, Harrison, Harrison." The voices were soft, almost whispered, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound didn't diminish. If anything, it grew clearer. "Nobody's supposed to be back there," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. "The night shift. There's only supposed to be one nurse on duty." Navy David tilted his head slightly. "Who told you that?" I couldn't remember. The information had just been there in my head, like something I'd always known. But now that I thought about it, I couldn't recall how I'd learned it or even if it was true. The whispering of my name continued, a soft chorus that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. I backed away from the reception desk, bumping into one of the plastic chairs. The sound was sharp and jarring in the antiseptic quiet. "I think I should go," I said. But when I turned toward the entrance, the sliding glass doors were dark. Beyond them, I could see nothing but black void, as if the hospital had been picked up and dropped into deep space. The parking lot lights, the street lamps, even the exit signs, all gone. My pulse quickened, and I could feel sweat forming on my palms despite the cool air conditioning. I approached the doors anyway, hoping they would open automatically as they had when I entered. Nothing happened. I waved my arms in front of the sensors. Still nothing. "The doors seem to be malfunctioning," Navy David said from behind me. His voice was closer now, though I hadn't heard him move. Maintenance issue. Happens all the time on the night shift. I turned back to face him, and that's when I noticed that all three Davids were now facing me directly. Smiling David's grin had somehow grown wider, stretching his face in ways that didn't look quite human. Dead-eyed David's lifeless stare was now fixed on me with laser focus. And Navy David was smiling too, but it was different from the others. His smile was knowing, like he was in on a joke that I wasn't getting. "The consultation room is just down this hallway," he said, gesturing again toward the door. "Very quiet, perfect for people who have trouble sleeping." The whispering of my name had grown louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the direction Navy David was pointing, from the darkened corridors of the hospital's interior. I could see the hallway beyond the door, sterile white walls stretching into shadow, broken only by the occasional emergency light, casting sickly yellow pools on the floor. "I don't think this is real," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "This can't be real." "What's real?" Navy David asked. "You came here because you couldn't sleep. Sleep is when we process reality, when our minds sort through what's real and what isn't. But you haven't been sleeping, have you, Mr. Harrison? So how would you know?" The logic was twisted but somehow compelling. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to think clearly through the exhaustion and the growing sense of unreality. Everything felt hyper-real and dreamlike at the same time. The two bright lights, the two clean floors, the impossible silence broken only by the mechanical hum of air conditioning and the whispered repetition of my name. 23 hours, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. "I haven't slept in 23 hours. 23 hours, 23 days, 23 years, Navy David said. "Time gets funny when you don't sleep. Things start to blend together. You start to see things that might be there, might not be there. Hear voices that might be real, might be in your head." I looked back at the other two Davids. They were both staring at me now, their expressions slowly shifting. Smiling David's grin was beginning to look more like a grimace, his features seeming to melt and reform in the fluorescent light. Dead-eyed David's stare had become predatory, hungry. "The consultation room," Navy David said again. "We can help you sleep there. Deep sleep. The kind where you don't dream." Something about that phrase sent ice through my veins. I stumbled backward, away from all three of them, until my back hit the wall near the entrance. The glass doors remained dark and motionless behind me. That's when I saw him. In the far corner of the waiting room, partially hidden behind a pillar, stood a fourth figure. This one wore green scrubs instead of blue, and his name tag was different. Marcus, RN. He was older than the Davids, with graying hair and worried eyes. Most importantly, he looked real in a way the others didn't. There was something solid about him, something that belonged in the normal world. He caught my eye and slowly shook his head, then gestured with his thumb toward a hallway I hadn't noticed before, one that led in the opposite direction from where Navy David wanted to take me. "The thing about night shifts," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the whispered chorus of my name, "is that not everyone who works them is supposed to be here." The three Davids turned toward him in perfect unison, their movements mechanical and wrong. Smiling David's grin finally faltered. Dead-eyed David blinked for the first time since I'd seen him. Navy David's businesslike composure cracked slightly. "Some folks," Marcus continued, "they get caught between shifts, between sleeping and waking. They start working shifts that don't exist, helping patients that shouldn't be here." I understood then, or thought I did. The hospital was real, but something else was happening here too. Something that existed in the space between exhaustion and consciousness, between sanity and whatever lay beyond it. "You need to find the real exit," Marcus said, "but you need to do it before they align." "Align?" Marcus nodded toward the three Davids, who were now moving closer together. As they did, their faces began to shift and merge, becoming more similar, more uniform. Smiling David's grin returned, but became identical to Navy David's knowing smile. Dead-eyed David's expression shifted to match the others. "When the three faces become one," Marcus said, "nobody goes back to sleeping on this side." I didn't understand what that meant, but I understood the urgency in his voice. The whispered chorus of my name was growing louder, more demanding. The three Davids were almost touching now, and as they moved closer, the air in the waiting room seemed to thicken. Marcus gestured again toward the hallway behind him. "That way leads to the real hospital, to the real night shift, to real doctors who can help with real insomnia." I looked back at the three Davids. They were beginning to overlap now, their forms becoming translucent where they merged. The effect was disorienting, like looking at a double-exposed photograph. Without thinking, I bolted toward Marcus and the hallway behind him. The moment I started moving, the whispered chorus exploded into a cacophony of voices all calling my name, no longer soft or subtle, but demanding and angry. I reached Marcus just as the three Davids completed their merger. Where three separate figures had stood, now there was only one. But it was wrong. Too tall and too wide, with features that shifted constantly between the three faces I'd seen. The smile was too big, the eyes too deep, the proportions all wrong. "This way," Marcus said, leading me into the hallway. "Quickly." Behind us, I could hear something that might have been footsteps, or might have been something else entirely. The hallway Marcus led me down was different from the main corridor, warmer, more lived in. The fluorescent lights here flickered occasionally, and I could hear distant sounds of a real hospital. Monitors beeping, quiet conversations, the soft squeak of wheels on linoleum. We emerged into a smaller, more intimate waiting area. This one had magazines scattered on the tables, coffee stains on the carpet, and a reception desk that looked like it had been in use for years rather than minutes. Behind the desk sat a woman in pink scrubs, typing on a computer that actually seemed to have something on the screen. "Dr. Chen will see you now, Mr. Harrison," she said without looking up. "Room 3, down the hall." I turned back to thank Marcus, but he was gone. The hallway we'd just come from looked normal. No sign of the merged David thing or the impossible waiting room. Just a regular hospital corridor with regular fluorescent lights and regular sounds. "Mr. Harrison," the receptionist repeated. I nodded and walked toward room 3, my legs feeling unsteady. Everything seemed normal now, too normal, like I was seeing the world through a filter that made everything appear exactly as it should be. Dr. Chen was a small, efficient woman who listened to my symptoms with professional concern and prescribed a mild sleep aid. She mentioned that severe insomnia could cause hallucinations and episodes of confusion, especially when combined with stress and anxiety. She recommended follow-up appointments and lifestyle changes, all perfectly reasonable, all perfectly normal. I left the hospital 40 minutes later through doors that opened automatically and led to a parking lot full of cars under working streetlights. My own car was where I'd left it, keys in my pocket just as they should be. But as I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The prescribed sleep aid sat in my pocket like a small, hard promise, but I found myself reluctant to take it. Because what if Marcus had been wrong? What if the three faces hadn't aligned yet? What if they were still waiting, still calling my name in that antiseptic waiting room that existed somewhere between sleeping and waking? And what if, when I finally did fall asleep, I found myself back there again, but this time without a real nurse to show me the way out? I never did take those pills. Some questions, I decided, are better left unanswered. But sometimes, in that space between consciousness and sleep, I can still hear my name being whispered in chorus. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself smiling in ways that don't feel quite right.